What if the gods didn't abandon humanity because we disappointed them, but because we terrified them? What if hidden among tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets catalogued in museum basements, there exists a record so unsettling that it inverts everything we thought we understood about the Anunnaki, those enigmatic figures the Sumerians called those who from heaven to earth came? In the dimly lit archives of the British Museum and the Iraq Museum, on fragments of baked clay impressed with wedge-shaped marks 5,000 years old, there are texts that don't quite fit the standard narrative of gods and their obedient human servants. These are tablets that whisper of something else entirely. A moment when the created looked back at the creators, and the creators flinched. So, before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and forgotten truth. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient tension stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. Tonight, we descend into the archaeological record not as tourists of the exotic past, but as investigators of a suppressed moment in human prehistory. We'll trace the evidence through temple archives and palace libraries, through the meticulous work of Assyriologists who spent decades translating tablets that don't quite say what we expected them to say. This isn't a story about ancient astronauts or pseudo-archaeological speculation. This is about what the Sumerians themselves recorded in their most carefully preserved texts, the ones that reveal cracks in the cosmic hierarchy, the ones that suggest humanity was never meant to be quite so capable. In 1976, during routine cataloguing at the British Museum, a junior curator named Margaret Howard made a notation in her logbook about a tablet fragment that had arrived decades earlier in a collection purchased from a Baghdad antiquities dealer. The fragment, no larger than a playing card, carried fewer than 30 lines of old Babylonian cuneiform. Howard's note described it as genealogical material, possibly mythological context, unusual phrasing regarding divine human boundary. The fragment was assigned a provisional catalogue number. 3 weeks later, the fragment was transferred to a specialist for translation. It never arrived. When inquiries were made, the paperwork showed the transfer had been completed, but the specialist had no record of receiving it. The tablet had vanished somewhere in the Byzantine corridors of museum bureaucracy, and with it, whatever unusual phrasing had caught Margaret Howard's attention. The disappearance was not unusual in itself. Museum collections are vast, labyrinthine places where objects can migrate between storage rooms, get misfiled under incorrect catalogue numbers, or simply become separated from their documentation. The British Museum's cuneiform collection alone contains over 130,000 tablets and fragments, many still uncatalogued, many more catalogued but never fully translated. A single fragment, especially one bearing unfamiliar text, could easily slip between the cracks. What makes this particular loss significant is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. No follow-up inquiry was made, no search was conducted. The provisional catalogue number was never finalized. Margaret Howard's logbook notation remained the only evidence the fragment had ever existed. Years later, when a graduate student researching the museum's acquisition history came across Howard's note, she attempted to trace the fragment's path. She found the original purchase records from the Baghdad dealer, showing the lot had contained 47 fragments, mostly administrative texts from the old Babylonian period. She found the initial intake documentation, confirming all 47 fragments had been received and logged. She found Howard's notation, precise and clear. And then the trail simply ended. The transfer paperwork led nowhere. The specialist supposedly designated to receive the fragment had retired in the early 1980s and had died years before the graduate student began her search. His personal papers, donated to the university where he had taught, contained no mention of the fragment. In the careful, measured language of academic footnotes, The graduate student noted this as an unfortunate but not uncommon loss to the historical record. But privately, in conversation with her supervisor, she expressed a thought that would sound paranoid if whispered anywhere outside the closed doors of specialist academic circles. That some tablets, some fragments of the ancient world, carry information someone decided we weren't meant to know. That museum bureaucracy, with its endless transfers and recataloguing, its storage rooms that stretch like caves beneath the public galleries, makes an excellent labyrinth in which to lose things deliberately. That perhaps the fragment never disappeared at all, but was simply moved somewhere else, to a collection that doesn't appear in any catalogue, studied by specialists who publish in no journals. But this is speculation. The kind of thinking that ruins academic careers. What remains is the absence, the gap in the archive, and Margaret Howard's single line about unusual phrasing regarding the divine human boundary. Whatever that fragment said, whatever boundary it described, the words rest now in silence. To understand what might have been lost, we must first understand what the orthodox translations tell us about the Anunnaki. In the canonical Sumerian texts, the Mesopotamian epic of creation, the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, these beings are presented as a divine council, a pantheon of major and minor deities who shaped the cosmos and later, almost as an afterthought, fashioned humanity. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, literally offspring of Anu, the sky god. They numbered, according to various texts, either 50 or sometimes 600. They descended from the heavens, they labored to irrigate the earth, and when that labor became too burdensome, they created humans to carry the workload. This is the story as Samuel, Noah, Kramer, and Thorkild Jacobson presented it in the mid-20th century, as generations of scholars have refined it, as it appears in textbooks and museum placards, gods creating servants. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple versions spanning over 1,000 years, gives us the most detailed account of this creation. In the beginning, the text tells us, the Anunnaki gods drew lots and divided the cosmos. Anu took the sky, Enlil the earth, Enki the waters below. The lesser gods, the Igigi, were assigned the labor of digging irrigation canals, of making the Tigris and Euphrates run where the greater gods desired. For 40 years they dug, the text says, or in some versions, for 2,500 years, time becoming meaningless in mythological space. But eventually the Igigi rebel, they burn their tools, they march on Enlil's palace by night, and they demand release from their burden. The solution the gods devise is humanity. Enki, the clever one, the god of wisdom and crafts, proposes creating a substitute laborer. A god will be slaughtered, one of the rebels, and from his blood and flesh mixed with clay, the first humans will be formed. The goddess Nintu, the birth goddess, shapes 7 males and 7 females. They are given the breath of life. They are set to work. The Igigi are freed. The irrigation canals continue to be dug, but now by human hands. This is the purpose, the only purpose, for which we were made, to do the work the gods found too tedious to continue. It's a bleak creation story. When you sit with it, we were not made in love or curiosity. We were made to be tools, biological machinery designed to serve a function. The text is explicit about this. Humanity's purpose is agricultural labor, the maintenance of irrigation systems, the growing of food to supply the temples. We exist to free the gods from physical burden. And for a long time, in the orthodox reading of these texts, that's where the story ends. Gods made us. We serve. The cosmic hierarchy is clear, uncomplicated, eternal. But the Atrahasis doesn't end with human creation. It continues through generations, through the growth of human populations, through the attempts to control or eliminate humanity when we become too numerous, too successful, too present. And in those later passages, in the decision to send plague and drought and finally the flood, there are hints of something more complex than simple population management. There are moments when the gods' actions read less like maintenance of cosmic order and more like containment of a problem that got out of hand. The text never quite says what the problem is, only that humanity, left unchecked, becomes intolerable to the divine realm. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades translating Sumerian literature, noted in his later work that the relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian mythology was more ambivalent than biblical parallels would suggest. The gods need humans, depend on the sacrifices and labor we provide, yet repeatedly attempt to limit or destroy us. They create us, yet seem perpetually surprised or disturbed by what we become. The mythology presents this as divine prerogative, the gods' right to do as they please with their creation. But Kramer wondered, in careful academic language, whether the texts might preserve memories of something else, some genuine conflict or negotiation between groups the Sumerians remembered as gods and humans. This is the orthodox reading, as settled and stable as scholarship can make it. Gods made humans for labor. Humans proliferated. Gods attempted various forms of population control. Some humans survived through divine favor. Civilization rebuilt itself. The pattern repeats. It's a mythology that makes sense within its cultural context, that reflects the agricultural societies of ancient Mesopotamia, that poses no particular interpretive challenges. But even within the orthodox canon, there are texts that complicate this tidy narrative. The story of Adapa, preserved in fragments from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, tells of a human priest so knowledgeable and powerful that he accidentally broke the wings of the south wind itself when it capsized his fishing boat. Summoned before Anu to answer for this act of cosmic vandalism, Adapa was offered the bread and water of immortality, but following the advice of his patron god Enki, he refused them, believing them to be poison. He was sent back to Earth, mortal still, but the text lingers on Anu's reaction. The sky god is described as troubled, even shaken, by Adapa's wisdom. Here was a human who could injure the fabric of heaven itself, whose knowledge rivaled that of the minor gods, whose discernment was sharp enough to navigate divine politics. And the gods' response was not pride in their creation, but something closer to alarm. The story is fragmentary, as so many of these ancient texts are, preserved on 4 tablets found across multiple sites and time periods, none containing the complete narrative. The earliest version dates to the 14th century BCE, found at Amarna in Egypt among the diplomatic correspondence of Akhenaten's court, suggesting the story had spread far beyond its Mesopotamian origins. Later versions were discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, that great collection of Mesopotamian literature assembled by an Assyrian king who understood that knowledge was power and that the old stories contained knowledge worth preserving. What we have of Adapa tells us he was a sage, a priest of Enki, at the temple in Eridu, humanity's oldest city according to Sumerian tradition. He was wise, the text says, absurdly wise, possessing understanding that allowed him to perceive the workings of heaven and earth. He was also, apparently, temperamental. When the south wind overturned his fishing boat, he spoke a word of power and broke the wind's wings, leaving it unable to blow. In heaven, Anu noticed, the absence of the wind disrupted the cosmic order. Anu demanded to know who had damaged one of the fundamental forces of nature. When Adapa was brought before Anu to answer for this, Enki advised him carefully. "You will be offered bread and water," Enki warned. "Do not accept them. They will be the bread and water of death, meant to eliminate you for your transgression." So when Anu, seemingly impressed by Adapa's wisdom and power, offered him the bread and water of life, immortality itself. Anu laughed, though the text doesn't make clear whether it was laughter of amusement or something darker. "Why have you refused immortality?" he asked, and Adapa explained that his god had warned him it was poison. Anu then revealed the truth. It had been the bread and water of life, and now the chance was lost. Adapa would return to Earth, mortal as ever, his opportunity for godhood rejected through Enki's deception, or protection, or test. But here's what makes the Adapa story significant beyond its narrative of a trick or a lost opportunity. The text describes Anu as disturbed by Adapa's presence, uncomfortable with the degree of knowledge this human possessed. Other translations render Anu's reaction as anger or fear, the Akkadian words permitting multiple interpretations. What's clear is that Adapa's wisdom was unexpected, problematic, something that shouldn't exist in a creature designed for agricultural labor. The text presents this as individual exceptionalism, Adapa as a unique figure, but it raises uncomfortable questions about what humans were becoming, what capabilities we were developing beyond the specifications of our original design. And then there's Enki's role in the affair, warning Adapa, protecting him from a gift that might have elevated him permanently beyond human status. Was Enki saving Adapa from a trap, from gods who had decided that immortal humans would be too dangerous? Or was Enki preventing Adapa from accepting a genuine offer, ensuring that humanity remained mortal, containable, ultimately limited? The text doesn't resolve this ambiguity. Enki, throughout Mesopotamian mythology, occupies this strange position, the god who creates humans, who teaches humans, who protects humans against other gods, but who also seems to understand that human elevation comes with cosmic costs. Scholars have debated the Adapa story's meaning for over a century. Most read it as an etiology, an explanation for why humans are mortal despite being created by gods. Some see it as a wisdom tale about the dangers of excessive pride or the importance of obedience to divine instruction. But there's another reading, quieter in academic circles, that treats Adapa not as an anomaly but as evidence. Evidence that humans were developing capacities beyond what the gods intended. Evidence that this development alarmed the cosmic powers. Evidence that measures were taken, whether through denial of immortality or other means, to ensure that humanity remained within certain boundaries. Adapa returned to Earth, mortal still, but the knowledge he possessed, the power he had demonstrated, didn't leave with him. He taught other sages. The wisdom passed down, and somewhere in heaven, the gods took note of what we were becoming. The Eridu Genesis, one of humanity's oldest flood narratives, contains a passage that has puzzled translators for decades. Before the decision to send the deluge, the text describes the Anunnaki in council, deliberating over what the Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson translated as the noise of mankind. Humanity had become too numerous, too loud, too disruptive, but the Sumerian word translated as noise, rigmu, carries connotations beyond mere sound. In other contexts, it can mean tumult, clamour, but also uprising or complaint. Some scholars have suggested the passage describes not just population pressure, but a kind of spiritual or cosmic disturbance caused by human activity. The gods couldn't sleep, the text says. But what kind of noise keeps gods awake? What were humans doing that generated this unbearable disruption in the divine realm? The Eridu Genesis is fragmentary, as are so many of these earliest texts. We have perhaps a third of the original composition preserved on a single tablet excavated from the ancient city of Nippur in the early 20th century. The tablet itself dates to around 1700 BCE, but the composition is older, perhaps much older, drawing on traditions that reach back into the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. What survives tells of the creation of cities, the establishment of kingship, and then, suddenly, the decision to destroy everything with a flood. The word Rigmu appears in the crucial passage where the gods debate humanity's fate. The translation noise has become standard, appearing in virtually every English rendering of the text. But the Sumerian word is richer and stranger than that simple translation suggests. In economic texts, Rigmu can refer to property disputes or legal complaints. In political contexts, it can describe civil unrest or rebellion. In one rare usage in a wisdom text, it refers to the sound of foundries and workshops. The industrial noise of human manufacturing, the word contains within it both the acoustic and the social, both sound and the meanings that sound carries. So, when Enlil complains of humanity's Rigmu keeping the gods from sleep, what exactly is keeping them awake? The standard interpretation treats this as metaphor for overpopulation. Humans had multiplied beyond sustainable levels, straining the environment, creating pressure on resources. And the gods, who depended on human sacrifices and offerings, saw their supply threatened by human overextension. The flood was ecological management, harsh but necessary. This reading makes sense within the agricultural context of ancient Mesopotamia, where population pressure against water resources was a constant concern. But there's another layer to the passage that becomes visible when you look at what comes immediately before the complaint about noise. The text describes humanity spreading across the earth, building cities, establishing kingship, developing crafts and technologies. The preceding lines mention the invention of music, the creation of written records, the building of temples that reach toward heaven. What if the Rigmu that disturbed the gods wasn't merely population numbers but the acoustic signature of civilization itself? The sound of humans doing things we were never meant to do, becoming something we were never meant to become? The French Assyriologist Jean Bottero, writing in the 1980s, suggested that the Rigmu passage might reflect Mesopotamian anxieties about urbanization, the transition from scattered agricultural settlements to concentrated city-states. Cities were noisy in ways villages never were. The sound of workshops and markets, of construction and crowds, of a density of human activity that was historically new. Perhaps the mythology was encoding this social transformation, the gods' displeasure, standing in for older generations' discomfort with urban life. But Bottero also noted something else, a detail that most scholars have treated as unrelated but which feels significant when considered alongside the Rigmu complaint. In several Mesopotamian texts, including fragments of the Atrahasis that parallel the Eridu Genesis, the gods' decision to send the flood is preceded by descriptions of humans becoming too wise or possessing too much understanding. The exact phrasing varies across versions and translations, but the sentiment remains consistent. Humanity had crossed some cognitive threshold, had achieved some level of knowledge or awareness that made continued peaceful coexistence with the gods impossible. This cognitive concern is never explained in the texts. It's presented as self-evident, as if the Mesopotamian audience would understand immediately why excessive human wisdom would threaten the cosmic order. Modern readers stumble over this. Why would gods, immortal and powerful, care if their servants became knowledgeable? Wouldn't wiser servants be more useful? The texts don't provide answers, only the repeated pattern. Humans develop, humans achieve, gods become uncomfortable, gods attempt limitation or destruction. There's a tablet in the British Museum, catalogue number K3543+, containing a version of the flood story from the library of Ashurbanipal. In this version, before the flood decision, there's a line that appears in no other version of the story. The tablet is damaged, and the line is partially reconstructed, but the surviving words translate approximately as they have learned the ways of heaven. The next surviving line is Enlil's declaration that humanity must be destroyed. Whatever the ways of heaven referred to, whatever humans had learned, it was grounds for annihilation. Imagine holding that tablet, feeling the weight of baked clay that has survived 27 centuries, tracing the wedge marks pressed into mud when the words were still shocking, still urgent. Somewhere in the gap between "they have learned the ways of heaven" and "they must be destroyed" lies the answer to what made humanity intolerable. The answer is gone now, broken away when the tablet fractured, lost to time and accident. But the structure of the argument remains. Human knowledge equals human danger equals divine response. It's a logic that runs through the flood narratives like a seam of darker clay through a brick, visible if you know where to look. In Sumerian cosmology, the fundamental powers and knowledge that govern civilization are called the Me. Abstract divine decrees that cover everything from kingship and priesthood to metalworking and sexual intercourse. These Me were not human inventions but divine possessions, carefully guarded by the gods, particularly by Enki in his temple at Eridu. Yet multiple myths describe the transfer, sometimes through trickery or theft, of these Me to humanity. In the story of Inanna and Enki, the goddess of love gets the wisdom god drunk and steals the Me, delivering them to her city of Uruk. The text plays this for comedy, Enki's hungover regret at his generosity, but beneath the humour lies a more unsettling premise. The knowledge that allows civilization to function was never meant for human hands. Every time we exercise these powers, we're operating stolen divine software, and somewhere in the cosmic hierarchy, someone knows it. The concept of the Me is unique to Mesopotamian thought, difficult to translate precisely because it has no exact parallel in other mythological systems. The word appears across thousands of years of cuneiform texts, its meaning shifting slightly but remaining essentially stable. The Me are the fundamental decrees or powers or attributes that make civilization and cosmos function. There are lists of Me preserved in various tablets, catalogues that run to over 100 distinct items. Some are abstract: justice, wisdom, truth, falsehood. Some are social: kingship, priesthood, eldership, slavery. Some are technical: metalworking, leatherworking, basket weaving, building. Some are sexual: prostitution, the art of love, fertility. The Me encompass everything that separates civilized humanity from animals or chaos. Crucially, the Me are not natural laws but divine possessions. They can be given, stolen, lost, transferred. They exist as distinct objects or forces that can be moved from one location or person to another. In the mythology, Enki holds most of the Me in his temple at Eridu, the oldest city, the place where civilization first emerged from the primordial waters. He guards them, administers them, occasionally distributes them to other gods or favored humans, but always the Me remain divine property, lent to humanity conditionally, subject to recall. The story of Inanna and Enki tells how the goddess of love and war traveled to Eridu to visit Enki in his temple. Enki, pleased by her presence, prepared a feast. They drank beer together, the text tells us, cup after cup, in a ritualized exchange of toasts. Enki, growing increasingly drunk, began offering Inanna gifts, the Me themselves, the fundamental powers of civilization. With each cup of beer, he handed over more Me, the crown of kingship, the throne of authority, the art of metalworking, the art of war, the art of sexual intercourse, the art of decision-making. On and on through the list. Enki giving away the cosmic operating system while intoxicated beyond judgment. Inanna accepted each gift, loading them into her boat. When Enki finally passed out, she sailed away toward her city of Uruk, carrying the Me with her. When Enki woke and realized what he had done, he sent monsters and demons to intercept Inanna, to retrieve the Me before they reached Uruk. But Inanna's vizier, Ninshuba, defended the boat at each attempt. The Me reached Uruk safely. Civilization, the text implies, was transferred from Eridu to Uruk through divine drunkenness and theft. The story is entertaining, structured like a folktale with repetitive challenges and clever victories. Generations of readers have treated it as mythological comedy, a just-so story explaining how Uruk became the greatest city of early Sumer. But the German Assyriologist Bent Alster pointed out in the 1970s that the story's comic surface covers a darker implication, that the powers humans used to build civilization were acquired through deception, that we possess capabilities we were never supposed to have, that somewhere in the divine realm there's an awareness of this theft and a lingering desire to recover what was taken. Other myths tell different versions of how humans acquired the me. In some texts, Enki deliberately teaches certain me to humanity as part of his role as god of wisdom and civilization. In others, humans discover or develop me through their own efforts, and the gods reluctantly acknowledge these acquisitions. But in virtually every version, there's tension around the transfer. The other gods disapprove of Enki's generosity. Enlil particularly is portrayed as opposed to human elevation, preferring that we remain ignorant and limited. The mythology preserves a memory of conflict within the divine council about how much humans should know, how much we should be capable of, how close we should come to divine status. And then there are the me that are never quite explained, the ones that appear in lists but whose meaning remains obscure even to translators. Items like the me of descent to the underworld, or the me of truth, or the me of the troubled heart. These aren't crafts or social institutions, but something more abstract, more psychological or spiritual. They suggest the me encompass not just external technologies, but internal capabilities, ways of thinking and feeling, and perceiving that separate conscious beings from mere biological machines. What would it mean to possess the me of truth? To have within yourself the capacity to recognize and speak what is real, to cut through deception and illusion. What would it mean to possess the me of the troubled heart? To carry within yourself the awareness of mortality, loss, and existential uncertainty. These are not tools for irrigation or metalworking. These are capacities that make a being capable of existential thought, of questioning their place in the cosmic order, of perhaps even challenging that order. The Sumerians understood this, encoded it in their mythology. The me were dangerous. Their theft or transfer from gods to humans represented not just the acquisition of technical knowledge, but a fundamental shift in what humans were. We were supposed to be biological tools, designed for agricultural labor, but with the me, we became something else. Beings capable of kingship and priesthood, capable of art and warfare, capable of sexual love and existential trouble, capable of truth and falsehood and the discernment between them. We became, in short, too much like the gods themselves, and the mythology never quite forgets that this elevation was unauthorized, stolen, achieved against the will of at least some of the cosmic powers. Every cuneiform tablet that records these stories, every temple hymn that invokes the me, every administrative text that casually references them as part of the cosmic furniture, preserves this knowledge. We are operating beyond our design specifications. We possess capabilities we were never meant to have, and somewhere, in whatever heaven the Anunnaki withdrew to, this theft is remembered, though they originate in later Jewish apocalyptic literature. The Watchers, those rebellious angels who descended to mate with human women and teach forbidden knowledge, may preserve an echo of earlier Mesopotamian traditions about divine human knowledge transfer. The Book of Enoch describes 200 watchers who, moved by lust or pity, or perhaps something more complex, taught humanity, metallurgy, cosmetics, weaponry, astrology, and the cutting of roots and plants, which likely means medicine or perhaps pharmacological knowledge. For these teachings, the Watchers were punished, bound beneath the earth until the final judgment. The text treats this knowledge transfer as a cosmic crime, as transgression severe enough to warrant eternal imprisonment. What's striking is not the mythology itself, but the paranoia it reveals about humans possessing certain kinds of knowledge. As if there were categories of understanding that constitute spiritual weapons, tools we weren't supposed to have. The Book of Enoch is not Sumerian. It was written much later, in the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era, in Hebrew or Aramaic, by Jewish scribes working in a world already centuries removed from ancient Mesopotamia. Yet the text carries echoes of older stories, patterns of divine human interaction that feel Mesopotamian in their structure and anxiety. The watchers themselves, called the Grigori in some translations, are presented as a class of angels assigned to watch over humanity. But watching became wanting. The text describes them looking down from heaven, seeing the beauty of human women, and descending to take them as wives. From these unions came the Nephilim, giants, beings of mixed divine and human nature, who became mighty warriors and consumed vast resources. But the real transgression, the act that sealed the Watcher's fate, was not the sexual unions, but what came after. The teaching. The Book of Enoch lists the knowledge each Watcher imparted. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, and taught women cosmetics and the beautifying of eyelids and the use of precious stones. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs of the stars. Zikiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Shamziel taught the signs of the sun. And so on through the list of 200 names, each watcher responsible for transferring some specific category of knowledge from heaven to earth. What's remarkable about this catalogue is how practical most of the knowledge is. This isn't abstract philosophical wisdom, but technical expertise. How to work metal, how to read the stars, how to use plants for medicine or alteration of consciousness, how to adorn the body, how to make weapons. These are the foundations of civilization. The same categories of knowledge the Sumerians called the me, and in both traditions, this knowledge transfer is treated as transgressive, as a breach of cosmic order that requires punishment. The punishment in the Book of Enoch is severe and eternal. The Watchers are bound beneath the earth in a place called Dudael, trapped in darkness until the final judgment. Their giant offspring, the Nephilim, are destroyed, but their spirits become demons that roam the earth, causing suffering. As for humanity, now in possession of knowledge we were never meant to have, we are left to deal with the consequences. Warfare enabled by metallurgy, vanity enabled by cosmetics, the disruption of natural order through medical and pharmacological intervention, the ability to predict celestial events and perhaps imagine we understand the mechanics of heaven. The medieval scholar and translator R. H. Charles, who produced the standard English translation of the Book of Enoch in 1906, noted in his commentary that the text seemed obsessed with the dangers of knowledge itself, as if certain forms of understanding were inherently corrupting. Charles, writing in the optimistic age of early 20th century scholarship, found this attitude puzzling. Why would knowledge of metallurgy or astronomy be considered spiritually dangerous? His footnotes struggle with this question, ultimately suggesting that the text reflects primitive anxieties about technological change. But there's another way to read the Watcher's story, one that takes seriously the text's own logic. What if the knowledge they taught wasn't dangerous because it was evil, but because it was equalizing? What if metallurgy threatened divine supremacy because armed and armored humans became harder to control? What if astronomy threatened the gods because understanding celestial mechanics meant understanding that the heavens operated by predictable laws rather than divine whim? What if medicine and pharmacology threatened the cosmic order because they gave humans power over life and death? over consciousness and perception, domains previously reserved for divine intervention. The Book of Enoch presents the post-Watcher world as one of increased suffering, but it's also a world of increased human capability. We can make tools and weapons. We can adorn ourselves. We can predict eclipses. We can heal diseases or alter consciousness through plant knowledge. We are, in short, less dependent on divine intervention, more capable of shaping our own existence. And from the perspective of beings whose authority depends on human dependence, this capability would indeed look like corruption, like a fall from a proper order where gods commanded and humans obeyed. The text was preserved not in Hebrew but in Ethiopic. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which alone among Christian traditions maintained the Book of Enoch as scripture. In the rest of the Christian world, it was lost, known only through references and quotations until fragments were rediscovered in the 18th and 19th centuries. Why did this particular text survive in Ethiopia while disappearing elsewhere? Perhaps because Ethiopian Christianity, developing in relative isolation from Roman and Byzantine theological politics, maintained older traditions, older stories that other branches of the faith decided were too problematic, too ambiguous about the nature of knowledge and divine authority. What survives in the Book of Enoch may be a distant memory of the same anxieties preserved in Sumerian mythology, that human knowledge is stolen or gifted divine knowledge, that we possess capabilities we were never meant to have, and that somewhere in the cosmic hierarchy, this theft is remembered and resented. The Watchers, bound beneath the earth for teaching us, are the Mesopotamian gods withdrawing to heaven after the flood. The same pattern of divine retreat following human elevation, the same suggestion that close contact between gods and humans becomes untenable once humans achieve certain thresholds of understanding. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE, but drawing on earlier sources, chronicles the rulers of Sumer from mythological times through historical dynasties. What makes this document archaeologically strange is the stark discontinuity it records. Before the flood, kings reigned for impossibly long periods, 10,000 years, 43,000 years. Then the flood swept over the earth, and when kingship was lowered from heaven again, the reigns become merely implausibly long, measured in hundreds rather than tens of thousands of years. Something fundamental changed. The text treats this break as a reset of human civilization, but read carefully, it suggests not just a demographic catastrophe, but a restructuring of the relationship between gods and humans, as if the pre-flood order had to be dismantled because it had produced something unintended. The king list exists in multiple versions, preserved on clay tablets and prisms from various cities and periods. The most complete version, known as the Weld Blundell prism, sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, a four-sided clay column inscribed with the names of kings from the beginning of time through the early 2nd millennium BCE. Reading down the columns is like watching time itself shift and break. In the beginning, kingship was lowered from heaven to the city of Eridu. The first king, Alulim, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, reigned for 36,000 years. The numbers are absurd, impossible. Yet the text presents them with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses for historical kings whose reigns are archaeologically verified. 8 cities received kingship before the flood, the text tells us. 5 kings in Eridu, 3 in Bad Tibira, 1 in Larak, 1 in Sippar, 1 in Shurapak. The shortest reign was 18,600 years. The longest was 43,200 years. The total time from the descent of kingship to the flood was 241,200 years, according to one version of the list. Though other versions calculate differently, these are not numbers that make sense in human terms. They're mythological time, deep time, the vast stretches of duration that separate divine ages from human history. Then comes the line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After this, kingship is lowered from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish. But the reigns are different now. The first king of the post-flood dynasty, Gower, reigned for 1200 years. Still implausible, still beyond human lifespan, but a dramatic reduction from the pre-flood numbers. As the list continues through subsequent dynasties, the reigns gradually decrease further, approaching what might be actual historical durations. By the time it reaches kings, we can verify through other sources. The Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, analysing the king list in the mid-20th century, noted that the document appears to encode a transition from mythological to historical time, from divine to human rulership. The pre-flood kings were not quite human, not quite gods, something in between, ruling for spans that suggest immortality or near immortality. The post-flood kings were still connected to divine authority, kingship still lowered from heaven, but they were mortal, limited, operating within timescales closer to human experience. But why does the flood mark this transition? Why does the text present a catastrophic break followed by a fundamental change in the nature of kingship and, by extension, human relationship to the divine? The king list itself doesn't explain. It simply records the pattern. Before the flood, one kind of order. After the flood, another kind of order. The change is presented as fact, as cosmic restructuring that requires no justification or elaboration. Yet, when you read the king list alongside other Mesopotamian flood narratives, a pattern emerges. The pre-flood world is consistently presented as one where the boundary between divine and human was more permeable, where lifespans approached immortality, where kings were semi-divine figures who ruled for epochs rather than decades. This was the world that became intolerable to the gods, the world that had to be destroyed and reset. The post-flood world is one where boundaries are clearer, where humans are more firmly mortal, where divine authority is more distant and mediated. The flood was not just demographic reset, but cosmic restructuring. It was meant to establish new rules, new limitations, a new relationship between heaven and earth. The fact that kings still reigned for hundreds of years after the flood suggests the gods didn't entirely succeed in reducing humanity to normal mortal limits, that something of the pre-flood order survived, but the trajectory is clear. Progressive normalization, progressive limitation, progressive distancing of the human from the divine. There's a fragment of a text, published in a 1973 article by the Assyriologist Wilfrid Lambert, that seems to be an alternative version of the king list, or perhaps a commentary on it. The fragment is badly damaged, but the surviving portions describe the pre-flood kings not just as rulers, but as those who bridged heaven and earth. And it refers to their impossibly long reigns as the time when the boundary was not yet fixed. The implication is clear. The pre-flood world was one where the separation between divine and human was incomplete, still negotiable, and the flood was the mechanism by which the gods finally established firm boundaries. The post-flood world is the world we still inhabit, the world where gods are in heaven and humans are on earth, and between them is a gulf carefully maintained. But the king list preserves the memory of a different arrangement, a time when that gulf didn't exist or was less firmly established, when humans could reign for 43,000 years, when kingship meant something closer to divinity than administration. And the text preserves the knowledge that this older arrangement was deliberately ended, that the flood was not natural disaster but divine intervention, that the cosmic order we inhabit now is a constructed order built on the ruins of something else. Among the Anunnaki, one figure emerges as consistently problematic to the divine order: Enki, god of wisdom, water, and crafts. In text after text, Enki is the one who warns humanity of the coming flood, who teaches humans agriculture and writing, who creates humans in the first place against the wishes of other gods. In the Atrahasis, when the Anunnaki decide to destroy humanity with plague, drought, and finally deluge, it's Enki who subverts each attempt, teaching humans countermeasures and finally instructing the hero Atrahasis to build an ark. The text presents Enki as benevolent, but there's another way to read his actions. As a divine whistleblower, a member of the cosmic elite who betrays his class because he recognizes something in humanity that the other gods either don't see or refuse to acknowledge. His loyalty, repeatedly, is to the created rather than the creators, and the mythology never quite explains why. Enki's temple was at Eridu, humanity's oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, where the archaeological layers descend into the 5th millennium BCE, down through stratum after stratum of temple rebuilding, each new structure built precisely atop the ruins of the one before, maintaining sacred continuity across centuries. The temple was called the Abzu, the fresh water ocean beneath the earth, and Enki's role was to manage these waters, to ensure their flow through springs and rivers, to maintain the irrigation systems that made civilization possible. He was god of wisdom, of crafts, of magic, of everything that required intelligence and technical skill. But Enki's relationship with humanity goes beyond his technical portfolio. In the Sumerian creation myths, when the gods decide to create humans to take over the labor of irrigation, it's Enki who designs us, who mixes the clay and divine blood, who shapes the prototype. The goddess Nintu does the actual birth work, but Enki provides the knowledge and the pattern. Humans are, fundamentally, Enki's project, his creation, his responsibility. This would explain his protective attitude, the way he repeatedly intervenes to save humanity from the destruction planned by other gods. In the Atrahasis, when the gods decide to reduce human population through plague, Enki instructs Atrahasis to have the people stop worshipping all gods except the plague god, to concentrate all offerings and prayers toward this one deity. The plague god, flattered and satiated by the focused worship, withholds the plague. When the gods try drought instead, Enki teaches humans to focus worship on the rain god, and the drought breaks. Each attempt at population control, Enki subverts by teaching humans how to manipulate divine psychology, how to use the gods' own needs for worship and sacrifice against them. Finally, when the gods decide on the flood, Enlil makes Enki swear an oath not to warn humanity directly. Enki agrees to the oath, but then he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, describing in detail the coming deluge and the instructions for building an ark. He's not speaking to a human, technically, just thinking aloud near a wall. If Atrahasis happens to overhear through that wall, well, Enki kept his oath. The text presents this as clever wordplay, the wise god outsmarting his own promise. But it's also breathtaking betrayal of the divine consensus, a god deliberately sabotaging the agreed plan of his peers. Why does Enki do this? The texts never quite say. They present his actions as naturally benevolent, the way a craftsman might protect his creation, or a father might protect his children. But there's something more complex happening, something the mythology circles around without naming. Enki doesn't just protect humanity, he educates us, elevates us, gives us tools and knowledge that make us more capable, more independent, more like gods ourselves. The me that he guards and occasionally distributes, the wisdom he teaches, the technical skills he imparts, all of it moves humanity away from the simple laborer role we were designed for, and towards something more autonomous and threatening. In one fragmentary text, preserved in multiple versions but never completely intact, there's a dialogue between Enki and Enlil after the flood. Enlil is angry that humans survived, that Enki warned them, that the reset was incomplete. Enki's response, in the surviving lines, includes the phrase, "they were already becoming." The rest of his argument is lost to damage, but that phrase remains. They were already becoming. Becoming what? The text doesn't specify, assumes the reader knows or can infer, but the structure of the argument is clear. Enki is defending his protection of humanity by pointing to something we were developing, some potential we were manifesting, that made our complete destruction unjustifiable. Some scholars read this as moral argument, that humans had developed ethical capacity or spiritual worth that deserved preservation. But there's another reading, darker and more consistent with the mythology's recurring patterns, that humans were becoming too much like gods for simple extermination to be feasible, that we had crossed some threshold where our destruction would be either impossible or would have consequences the gods weren't willing to face. Enki protected us, not out of sentiment but out of recognition of what we had become. And his argument to Enlil was not moral but practical. Destroying humanity might no longer be within the gods' power. This reading makes Enki not quite the benevolent father figure most interpretations present, but something more ambiguous, a god who recognized early what humanity was capable of becoming and chose to ally with that potential rather than fight it. His repeated interventions were not just protection but investment, cultivation of human capability, because he understood that the future belonged not to gods, but to whatever humans were evolving into. He was the first to recognize that the created might eventually surpass the creators, and he chose to be on the winning side of that transition. The mythology presents Enki as the friend of humanity, and by most measures he was. But friendship in mythology is never simple. Prometheus gave humans fire and was punished eternally. The Watchers gave humans knowledge and were bound beneath the earth. Enki gave humans everything, repeatedly, systematically, often against divine consensus, and remained unpunished, which suggests either that his fellow gods never quite understood what he was doing, or that they understood perfectly and knew that punishing him would accomplish nothing, that the process he had set in motion was already irreversible. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel is usually read as a morality tale about human pride, but its Mesopotamian origins suggest a more complex meaning. In Sumerian tradition, the great ziggurats, those stepped temple towers, were called mountains of the gods. The building of such structures was considered a holy act, sanctioned by the gods themselves. Yet the Babel narrative describes divine panic at human architectural achievement, a fear that nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them, leading to the scattering of languages and peoples. This is not a god offended by arrogance, but gods genuinely frightened by human capability, taking active measures to limit human coordination and technical achievement. The question becomes, what exactly did the gods think humans were about to accomplish? The Tower of Babel story appears in Genesis, chapter 11, a brief narrative of only 9 verses. But those verses have generated millennia of interpretation and artwork. The basic story is familiar. Humanity, still speaking one language, settles in the land of Shinar and decides to build a city with a tower that reaches to heaven. God comes down to see the city and tower and says to other divine beings, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech." The languages are scattered, the people disperse across the earth, the tower is abandoned incomplete. But Shinar is Sumer, the Hebrew word used for the tower's building material. Beina means mud brick, the building material of Mesopotamia, where stone was rare. The tower itself, described as having its top in the heavens, matches the description and function of a ziggurat, those massive stepped temple platforms that dominated the skyline of every major Mesopotamian city. The story is set explicitly in Mesopotamian context, drawing on Mesopotamian architectural forms, and most scholars agree it reflects traditions about actual Mesopotamian ziggurats, perhaps specifically the great ziggurat of Babylon, the Anunnaki, whose name means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. In Mesopotamian tradition, ziggurats were not acts of hubris, but acts of piety. They were called mountains because the gods had originally dwelt on cosmic mountains, and by building artificial mountains, humans were creating suitable dwelling places for gods who had descended to the flat alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. Each ziggurat had a temple at its summit where the city's patron god would reside, and priests would climb the long stairways to perform rituals and maintain divine presence. The ziggurat was a bridge between earth and heaven, a physical structure enabling communication and exchange between realms. So why does the Genesis narrative present this temple building as threatening? Why do the divine beings panic at human architectural capability? The text gives us God's own reasoning. If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This is not anger at pride or arrogance. This is fear of capability, recognition that unified humans, able to coordinate through shared language, have effectively unlimited potential. The tower itself is almost incidental. The real threat is human coordination, human ambition, human technical skill applied to large-scale projects. The response is telling: don't destroy the tower, don't destroy humanity, but break the ability to coordinate. Scatter the languages so that large-scale collaboration becomes difficult. Force humans into smaller groups, unable to understand one another, unable to pool knowledge and effort effectively. It's a targeted intervention, precise limitation of specific human capacity, and it suggests the divine powers understood exactly what they were preventing. Not a building, but what that building represented. The threshold of capability that large-scale human cooperation could achieve. What were humans about to accomplish that frightened the gods so badly? The text doesn't say. It simply presents the fact of divine fear and the response of linguistic scattering. But the ziggurat itself offers clues. These weren't just temples but astronomical observatories, platforms from which Mesopotamian priests tracked celestial movements with precision. They were also archives, storing tablets of accumulated knowledge. They were universities, training centers for scribes and priests. They were communication hubs, coordinating the activities of entire city-states. A completed ziggurat, a perfected ziggurat, would be a fully functional interface between Earth and Heaven, a place where humans could observe the mechanics of the cosmos, accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations, and perhaps understand the operations of heaven itself. The French historian Georges Roux, writing about Mesopotamian civilization in the 1960s, noted that the ziggurat represented the apex of ancient engineering, requiring not just massive labor but sophisticated understanding of mathematics, material science, and architectural principles. Each ziggurat was precisely oriented to celestial directions, built with internal drainage systems to prevent water damage, constructed in stages over generations, with each generation maintaining exact alignment with the original plan. They were multi-generational projects requiring sustained social coordination, technical knowledge transfer, and centralized authority. A civilization that could build ziggurats was a civilization that had achieved social complexity, technical sophistication, and long-term planning capability far beyond simple agricultural communities. And if the Tower of Babel story preserves a memory of divine response to this achievement, then the gods weren't offended by the tower's height but alarmed by what building it demonstrated. That humans had reached a level of capability where we could reshape the landscape, could build structures that lasted centuries, could maintain complex projects across generations. We were no longer the simple laborers we had been designed to be. The scattering of languages, then, was not punishment but containment strategy. By breaking human linguistic unity, the gods ensured that knowledge would be harder to share, that coordination would be limited to smaller groups, that the kind of civilization-scale projects represented by the ziggurat would be difficult to replicate. It was a throttling of human potential, a limitation imposed not because we had done something wrong, but because we were becoming too capable, too unified, too close to achieving something the divine powers needed to prevent. And yet, the story ends with the tower abandoned, but not destroyed. The foundations remain, the knowledge that built it survives. Human civilization continues, now in scattered linguistic groups, but civilization nonetheless. The intervention slowed us but didn't stop us. We continued building, continued coordinating, continued reaching toward heaven through architecture and astronomy and accumulated knowledge. The Tower of Babel represents a moment when the gods recognized they had to act to limit human progress, and the fact that they chose to scatter languages rather than destroy humanity suggests they understood that complete destruction was either impossible or would create problems worse than those it solved. Among the more obscure Sumerian literary texts is a genre called disputation poems, in which two entities, often materials or tools, argue their superiority. One such text, fragmentary and rarely discussed outside specialist circles, is the debate between copper and silver, in which these two metals argue their value to civilization. What makes this text anthropologically significant is a brief passage in which copper claims that humans learned to work metal not from divine instruction, but through observation and experimentation, watching how fire transformed ore. Silver counters that this knowledge was stolen from heaven. The exchange is brief, almost throwaway, but it preserves a tension in Sumerian thought about whether human technical knowledge was gifted, stolen, or independently discovered, and the implications of each origin story for the relationship between gods and humans. The disputation poems were a popular literary form in ancient Sumer, training texts for scribal schools but also genuine literature, performed and copied and treasured. They pit two elements against each other in formalized debate. Summer and winter arguing which season is more essential, the pickaxe and the plough debating which tool is more important, the tree and the reed discussing their respective contributions to civilization. The debates follow predictable patterns, each side listing its benefits and mocking its opponent's weaknesses until a god judges between them or they reach accommodation. Most disputation poems are straightforward in their purposes, teaching students rhetorical techniques, exploring the interdependence of different elements in civilization, celebrating the fullness of creation. But the debate between copper and silver, preserved in fragments on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, contains that brief exchange that cuts deeper than mere rhetoric. The text is damaged, but the crucial lines survive in multiple copies, suggesting they were considered important enough to preserve carefully. Copper is speaking, defending itself against silver's claim of superiority based on rarity and beauty. Copper responds that while silver may be precious, copper is useful, essential to tools and weapons and vessels. And then comes the line that matters. Humans watched the mountain fire, saw stone flow like water, learned to make this happen themselves. The Sumerian phrasing is somewhat ambiguous, as ancient languages often are, but the basic meaning is clear. Metallurgy was not taught but observed, learned through human attention to natural processes and human experimentation in replicating those processes. Silver's response is immediate and sharp. That knowledge came from heaven, was carried down by those who brought the first wisdom. Silver claims that metallurgy is divine knowledge, part of the me, given or stolen from the gods, but not independently developed. And then the text moves on, the argument shifting to other topics, but the disagreement is never resolved. The poet leaves it hanging. Did humans learn metallurgy themselves, or did we acquire it from divine sources? The text doesn't choose. Why does this matter? Because the origin of human knowledge determines the nature of our relationship to the divine. If knowledge was gifted, then we owe the gods gratitude and obedience, and our use of knowledge is conditional on divine approval. If knowledge was stolen, then we are cosmic criminals, using capabilities we have no right to possess, and divine punishment might be justified or inevitable. But if knowledge was independently discovered, if we learned metallurgy by watching fire transform stone, then our capabilities are our own, developed through observation and experimentation, and the gods have no claim on our achievements. The debate between copper and silver doesn't resolve this question because Sumerian culture couldn't resolve it. The mythology contains all three origin stories for different kinds of knowledge. Some, are clearly gifted by gods, some are stolen by trickery, and some appear without clear divine involvement, suggesting independent human development. The Sumerians understood that these different origins had different implications, and the disputation poem preserves this uncertainty, this tension in how they understood their own capabilities. There's an archaeological dimension to this question as well. The development of metallurgy in the ancient world is one of the great mysteries of human technical achievement. Copper working appears in the Middle East around 7,000 years ago, requiring not just the recognition that certain green-stained stones are copper ore, but the knowledge that heating these stones to specific temperatures in reducing atmosphere will produce metallic copper. It requires experimentation, observation, the kind of systematic investigation we might call proto-scientific thinking. The archaeologist Theodor Wertheim, who spent decades studying the origins of metallurgy, argued that the discovery had to be accidental, probably occurring in pottery kilns where copper-bearing minerals were accidentally heated to smelting temperature. But the transition from accident to technique requires observation, recognition of cause and effect, experimental replication. Someone had to notice that fire plus greenstone plus specific conditions equals liquid metal. Someone had to repeat this, to test variables, to develop reliable techniques. This is human investigation, human learning, exactly what copper claims in the disputation poem. Yet the mythology consistently describes metallurgy as divine knowledge, something Enki possesses and occasionally imparts. In the Me lists, metalworking appears as a distinct divine power. In various myths, the god Nidaba or the goddess Nisaba or Enki himself teaches humans the craft of metal. The Sumerians couldn't reconcile the archaeological reality of metallurgy's development, which must have involved human experimentation and learning, with their theological understanding that all important knowledge comes from the gods. The debate between copper and silver preserves this contradiction without resolving it, and perhaps that's the most honest approach. Human knowledge is both discovered and received, both developed through our efforts and acquired from sources beyond ourselves. We learn by observation and experimentation, but we also learn from teachers, from inherited wisdom, from accumulated cultural knowledge. The question of ultimate origin, whether that accumulated knowledge trace back to divine gift or theft or human discovery, may be unanswerable, or the answer may be that all three processes operate simultaneously, that knowledge has multiple origins, that the boundary between discovered and given is less clear than we want it to be. What matters for understanding Sumerian anxiety about human capability is that the culture couldn't decide whether our knowledge was legitimate or stolen or gifted. We possessed capabilities. Clearly and undeniably, we could work metal and write and calculate and build, but the source and authorization of these capabilities remained ambiguous. And in that ambiguity lived the fear that perhaps we were operating beyond our authorization, that perhaps our achievements constituted cosmic transgression, that perhaps the gods would eventually demand an accounting for knowledge we had no clear right to possess. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest adventure story, is usually read as a meditation on mortality and the limits of human ambition. But it's also a text about a hybrid being, 2/3 god and 1/3 human, who possesses strength and understanding far beyond normal humans and uses these abilities to violate divine boundaries. Gilgamesh kills the Bull of Heaven. He journeys to the Garden of the Gods. He nearly obtains immortality. The gods' response is telling. They kill his companion Enkidu as punishment, but they cannot or will not kill Gilgamesh himself. He's too powerful, too protected, too entangled with the divine to simply eliminate. So instead, they let him live with his grief, his failure, his mortality. The text ends with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, mortal and humbled. But the gods never reclaim the knowledge and power he gained. Once given or taken, such things apparently cannot be revoked. The Epic of Gilgamesh is pieced together from tablets spanning over a millennium, from early Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh as king of Uruk to the standard Akkadian version compiled by a scribe named Sin-lik-un-Nini sometime in the 13th or 12th century BCE. The story was so important, so central to Mesopotamian culture, that it was copied and recopied, translated from Sumerian into Akkadian, Hittite, and Hurrian, found in libraries from Anatolia to Egypt. Whatever this story was doing, whatever cultural work it performed, mattered enough that civilizations across the ancient Near East wanted their own versions. At the story's center is Gilgamesh himself, described in the opening lines as 2/3 god and 1/3 human. The mathematics of this are deliberately impossible. You can't be 2/3 divine through normal reproduction. The fraction signals that Gilgamesh is not a regular hybrid but something stranger, something that shouldn't exist. Too much god and not enough human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, wise and all-knowing. His father was Lugalbanda, a deified king. Gilgamesh inherits strength and beauty and knowledge that place him somewhere between the human and divine realms, belonging fully to neither. The early tablets describe Gilgamesh as oppressive to his people, exhausting the young men with endless building projects and claiming sexual rights over brides. The people cry out to the gods for relief, and the gods create Enkidu, a wild man raised among animals, to be Gilgamesh's equal and companion. After Enkidu is civilized through the attentions of a temple priestess, he and Gilgamesh become inseparable friends. Together they journey to the cedar forest to kill its guardian, the demon Humbaba. Together they reject the goddess Ishtar's sexual advances. And when Ishtar, enraged by rejection, sends the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk, together they kill it. This killing of the Bull of Heaven is where Gilgamesh crosses the line the gods will not tolerate. Killing it was cosmic rebellion, the defeat of divine will by mortal strength. The gods convene in council to discuss this transgression. Someone must die for the killing of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, but they cannot agree to kill Gilgamesh. Instead, they choose Enkidu. The text doesn't explain why Gilgamesh is protected, only that he is. Enkidu falls ill with a divine sickness and dies over 12 days, while Gilgamesh watches helplessly. The death of Enkidu breaks something in Gilgamesh. For the first time, this being who is 2/3 divine confronts mortality not as abstract concept but as devastating loss. He refuses to bury Enkidu until maggots appear in the corpse, as if witnessing decay might make the death real or reversible. Then Gilgamesh abandons Uruk and wanders the wilderness, obsessed with finding immortality. If he is 2/3 god, why must he die like humans? Surely there must be a way to achieve the divine third that would make him fully immortal. His quest leads him to Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted immortality by the gods. Gilgamesh journeys through the mountain passage guarded by scorpion beings, through the garden of jeweled trees where the gods walk, across the waters of death itself. He reaches Utnapishtim and demands to know how to avoid death. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, explains that his immortality was a unique gift from the gods, never to be repeated. But he offers Gilgamesh a test. If you can stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, Perhaps you can conquer death. Gilgamesh fails immediately. He sits down and falls asleep. When he wakes, he denies he slept at all, and Utnapishtim has to show him the 7 loaves of bread, one baked each day he slept, now in various stages of decay, proof of time's passage. Gilgamesh has failed. But Utnapishtim's wife takes pity and tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the ocean, a plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh dives down, finds the plant, and begins his journey home, carrying at least the promise of renewed youth, if not true immortality. Then, while bathing in a pool, a serpent steals the plant and eats it, shedding its skin and escaping renewed, while Gilgamesh is left with nothing. He returns to Uruk, empty-handed, mortal still, but somehow reconciled to mortality. The epic ends with Gilgamesh showing the walls of Uruk to his ferryman, describing their construction, finding meaning in the city he built rather than the immortality he failed to achieve. Standard readings treat this as a story about accepting human limits, about finding meaning in accomplishment rather than immortality, about the dignity of mortality. And certainly the text supports this reading. But there's another dimension to the story that becomes visible when you focus on what Gilgamesh achieved rather than what he failed to achieve. He killed a divine guardian. He rejected a goddess. He killed the bull of heaven. He journeyed through spaces reserved for gods. He reached the flood survivor and learned the secret history of the cosmos. He obtained, briefly, the plant of youth, and he survived all of this. The gods couldn't or wouldn't kill him. Everything he learned, every boundary he crossed, every piece of divine knowledge he obtained, remained his. He returned to Uruk changed, carrying knowledge no human should possess, and the gods did nothing to reclaim it. The Epic of Gilgamesh suggests that once a being, even a partially divine being, crosses certain thresholds, acquires certain knowledge, those things cannot be taken back. The gods can punish, can allow failure and grief, can ensure mortality remains, but they cannot erase what has been learned, cannot undo the boundary crossings. Gilgamesh dies eventually, the text makes clear. But he dies having gone places and known things that should have been permanently beyond human reach. And if a being who is 2/3 God and 1/3 human can retain such knowledge despite divine displeasure, what might beings who are fully human but collectively numerous achieve and retain? The text never raises this question explicitly, but it haunts the margins of the story. Gilgamesh represents an experiment in human elevation, a being given too much divine nature, who uses that nature to exceed even the expectations of excess. And the god's response is not to destroy him or to reclaim what he learned, but simply to ensure he remains mortal. It's a compromise, an accommodation, as if the gods recognized that complete reversal of Gilgamesh's achievements was impossible or would cost more than they were willing to pay. In Akkadian mythology, the Tablet of Destinies, sometimes plural as Tablets of Destinies, is a divine object that grants its possessor supreme authority over the cosmos. Whoever holds it can decree fate itself. In the myth of Anzu, a bird-like deity steals the tablet from Enlil, the king of the gods, causing cosmic chaos until the warrior god Ninurta recovers it in combat. What's significant is that the tablet can be stolen, that divine authority is not inherent, but depends on possession of a physical object, and that the theft of this object doesn't just insult the gods but threatens the entire structure of reality. The mythology is explicit. The cosmic order is more fragile than it appears, and the wrong knowledge or tool in the wrong hands could unmake everything. The question the texts never quite ask is, what if those wrong hands were human? The Tablet of Destinies appears across multiple Mesopotamian myths, always as an object of supreme power, always as something that can be possessed, transferred, or stolen. Its very existence as a physical object rather than an inherent divine attribute is cosmologically significant. Divine authority is not something the gods are, but something they have, and what can be had can be lost. In the myth of Anzu, preserved in multiple versions across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian periods, the story begins with Anzu, a divine bird creature, serving Enlil in his temple. Anzu bathes Enlil, cares for his regalia, and eventually sees the tablet of destinies hanging in Enlil's chamber. The sight fills Anzu with desire. With the tablet, Anzu thinks, I could decree destinies. I could command the gods. I could reshape reality according to my will. So Anzu waits until Enlil is bathing, seizes the tablet, and flees to the mountains. Immediately, cosmic order begins to collapse. The text describes divine radiance fading, the regular patterns of ritual disrupted, the gods unable to exercise their authority. Enlil cannot decree fate without the tablet. The other gods cannot function under a cosmos where destinies are not being properly decreed. Everything depends on the tablet being in the right hands, and now it's in Anzu's claws, and Anzu is using it to make himself supreme, to restructure reality with himself at its center. The gods need a champion to recover the tablet. They ask several deities, but each refuses, recognizing that fighting someone who possesses the tablet of destinies is nearly impossible. Whoever holds the tablet can decree that weapons fail, that attacks miss, that the attacker falls. How do you fight someone who controls fate itself? Finally, Ninurta, the warrior god, accepts the challenge, but only after his mother, the goddess Mami, gives him weapons and tactics that might work against tablet-enhanced power. The battle is cosmic in scale. Ninurta shoots arrows, but Anzu decrees they fall harmlessly. Ninurta tries various strategies, but Anzu reshapes reality to counter each one. Finally, Ninurta cuts Anzu's wings, and in the moment of Anzu's fall, before he can decree protection, Ninurta strikes the killing blow and recovers the tablet. Order is restored. Enlil reclaims the tablet. The cosmos stabilizes. Ninurta is honored as savior of divine authority. But the story has revealed something the mythology can never quite put back in the box. Divine authority is contingent on possession of objects, and those objects can be stolen. The Tablet of Destinies is not the only such object. The Me we discussed earlier functions similarly as transferable sources of power and knowledge. Inanna's divine regalia, removed gate by gate in her descent to the underworld, are literal objects that grant divine status. Throughout Mesopotamian mythology, godhood is at least partially technological, dependent on possessing and wielding specific objects. This makes the cosmic order shockingly vulnerable. If divine power derives from objects, then anyone who obtains those objects gains that power. The mythology tries to contain this implication by ensuring that only divine beings steal divine objects, that the thefts occur within the divine family, that order is always eventually restored, but the vulnerability remains conceptually available. If Anzu could steal the Tablet of Destinies, if Inanna could steal the Me, if these transfers of cosmic authority are possible within the mythology, then the question becomes, what prevents humans from attempting the same thefts? The answer, never explicitly stated but implied throughout the texts, is that humans don't know these objects exist, or where they're kept or how to use them. Divine power is protected not by being inherently unavailable, but by being hidden, by humans not knowing what to look for or how to access it. But this is fragile protection. It depends on ignorance. And as we've seen throughout Mesopotamian mythology, human ignorance is not a stable state. We learn. We discover. We acquire knowledge we weren't meant to have. The trajectory of the mythology is toward progressive human knowledge. And if that trajectory continues, eventually we might learn about the Tablet of Destinies, about the Me in their fullness, about the objects and knowledge that grant divine authority. There's a fragment, published in a 1992 article in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies that describes a human king attempting to steal divine regalia from a temple. The text is badly damaged, but the surviving portions describe the king entering the temple's inner sanctum, reaching for objects described as the crown of heaven and the staff of decree, before being struck down by divine fire. The fragment ends with the gods discussing what the king attempted, and one surviving line reads, "He had learned where we keep the sources of authority." The king's attempt failed, but the knowledge that such sources exist, that they are kept in specific locations, that they can potentially be accessed, apparently survived the king's death. The Tablet of Destiny's mythology reveals a cosmos where power is object-dependent, where authority can be stolen, where the wrong being possessing the right tool could unmake reality. The gods work desperately to keep these objects secure, to limit knowledge of their existence and location, to ensure that cosmic authority remains within the divine family. But the mythology also reveals that these efforts are not always successful, that divine objects can be stolen, that cosmic authority can be transferred. The fact that only divine beings have successfully stolen these objects so far is not reassurance but warning. It means the thefts are possible, and if divine beings can do it, then sufficiently knowledgeable, sufficiently capable humans might attempt it too. When the goddess Inanna descends to the underworld in one of Sumerian literature's most haunting myths, she's forced to pass through 7 gates, removing one article of divine power at each gate until she arrives before her sister Ereshkigal naked and powerless. The cosmological implication is clear. Divine power is not intrinsic but worn, layered, removable. The gods are not fundamentally different from humans except in what they carry and wear. Strip away the me, the divine garments, the cosmic jewelry, and what remains? The myth doesn't quite answer this, but it opens a disturbing possibility. That divinity might be a matter of access and knowledge rather than essential being. And if access and knowledge can be transferred, then so can divinity itself. It's a mythology that makes godhood look uncomfortably like a technology rather than an ontological category. The descent of Inanna is preserved in Sumerian on tablets dating to around 2000 BCE, though the story is certainly older, drawing on traditions that reach back into the 3rd millennium. Inanna, goddess of love and war, queen of heaven, decides to descend to the underworld, the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The text never fully explains why Inanna makes this journey. Some lines suggest she intends to attend the funeral of Gugalana, the bull of heaven. Other lines suggest she seeks to expand her power by conquering even the underworld. Whatever her motivation, she prepares carefully. Before descending, Inanna dresses in her full divine regalia. The text catalogues each item: the crown of the step, the wig of her forehead, the small lapis beads around her neck, the twin egg-shaped beads at her breast, the gold ring on her hand, the breastplate of royal office, the robe of ladyship. Each item is not mere decoration but a source of power, a me made physical, an aspect of her divinity that can be worn and, crucially, removed. She also instructs her servant Ninshuba to seek help from the gods if she doesn't return within 3 days. Inanna approaches the first gate of the underworld. The gatekeeper asks why she has come. She claims to attend her brother-in-law's funeral. The gatekeeper goes to inform Ereshkigal, who gives strange instructions. Let Inanna enter, but according to the ancient rites, she must remove one item of clothing at each gate. So at the first gate, Inanna must remove her crown. She protests, but the gatekeeper is firm. These are the rites of the underworld, unchangeable, eternal. At each successive gate, Inanna loses another piece of her divine power. The wig, the necklace, the beads, the breastplate, the ring, the measuring rod, and line that mark her authority. Finally, her robe itself. She passes through the seventh gate completely naked, powerless, stripped of every attribute of divinity. Before Ereshkigal, Inanna has no authority, no power, nothing that distinguishes her from any other supplicant. Ereshkigal judges her, finds her guilty of something the text doesn't specify, and kills her. Inanna's corpse is hung on a hook on the wall like a piece of meat. 3 days pass. Ninshuba, as instructed, goes to the gods for help. Most refuse to intervene, but Enki, always Enki, takes pity. He creates 2 sexless beings from the dirt under his fingernails and sends them to the underworld carrying the food and water of life. These beings slip into the underworld, find Inanna's corpse, and revive it. Inanna escapes, reclaiming her divine regalia at each gate as she ascends, returning to the upper world restored to full power. But the myth has performed a revelation that cannot be undone. It has shown that divine power is separable from the divine being, that Inanna without her regalia is powerless, indistinguishable from any mortal soul judged before Ereshkigal. The implication cuts to the foundation of cosmic hierarchy. If divine power is worn rather than inherent, if it consists of objects that can be removed and put on again, then divinity is not an essential quality but an equipped status. The gods are powerful because they possess certain objects and knowledge, not because they are ontologically superior to humans. This reading is reinforced by the specific items Inanna wears. Several are identified explicitly as me, divine powers made into physical regalia. The measuring rod and line, for instance, represent the me of judgment and just rule. The breastplate represents sovereign authority. Each piece of jewelry or clothing embodies a specific divine capacity. Together, they make Inanna a goddess. Separated from them, she's vulnerable, killable, subject to the same death that claims humans. The German scholar Gwendoline Leake, analyzing the descent of Inanna in her work on Mesopotamian mythology, noted that the text deconstructs divine nature, revealing it as composite rather than essential, achieved rather than inherent. This observation aligns with the broader pattern we've been tracing. Mesopotamian mythology consistently presents divinity as something that can be acquired, transferred, lost, stolen. The gods are not beings of fundamentally different substance than humans, but beings who possess and wield certain powers and objects and knowledge that humans lack, which means, and the mythology never quite faces this directly, that if humans acquired those same powers and objects and knowledge, we would become functionally divine. The boundary between God and human is not ontological but epistemological and material. It's a boundary of what you know and what you possess, not what you essentially are. And boundaries of knowledge and possession are notoriously permeable, especially across the long spans of time and cultural development. There's a line in one version of the descent that appears in no other version, preserved on a tablet fragment from Ur. After Inanna returns from the underworld, after she has reclaimed all her divine regalia, she stands at the boundary between the underworld and the upper world and says something that the text marks as secret knowledge, words that should not be spoken outside mystery rites. The line, as preserved, translates approximately as, "What I am now, I wore to become, and what I wore, anyone might wear." The next line is damaged beyond recovery, but that single phrase survived, suggesting that at least some Mesopotamian thinkers understood the radical implication of their own mythology, that divinity is achieved status, and achievement, by definition, can be repeated. In every version of the Mesopotamian flood narrative, from the Eridu Genesis through Atrahasis to the flood tablet of Gilgamesh, the survivor is described as exceptionally wise, someone who understands things other humans don't. Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra. The names vary, but the characterization remains consistent. These were not random selections, but careful choices by Enki to preserve not just human genetic material, but human knowledge. The post-flood world is rebuilt not from scratch but from the memories and expertise of someone who knew the pre-flood order. This means every civilization that follows carries the DNA of that earlier, apparently problematic world that the gods tried to erase. The flood was meant to be a reset, but Enki ensured it was merely a setback, that humanity would remember, would rebuild, would eventually return to whatever threshold we had crossed that alarmed the cosmic powers. In the Atrahasis version, when Enki decides to warn the flood survivor, he chooses Atrahasis specifically because of his wisdom. The text calls him the Wise One, the one who understands, the human who has paid closest attention to Enki's teachings over the years. Atrahasis is not just a random faithful person, but someone Enki has been cultivating, educating, preparing for exactly this moment. The warning comes through the reed wall, but it comes to someone capable of understanding what the warning means, capable of building an ark according to specific technical instructions, capable of preserving not just himself and his family, but seeds and animals, and, by implication, the knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization. The Gilgamesh version gives us Utnapishtim, whose name means he who found life, and the text emphasizes his wisdom even more strongly. When Gilgamesh reaches him at the ends of the earth, Utnapishtim tells the flood story in detail, describing not just the event, but the politics behind it, the divine council's deliberations, Enki's warning, the specific construction of the ark. Utnapishtim knows divine secrets, understands cosmic politics, possesses knowledge that should be restricted to the gods themselves. And this knowledge survived the flood with him, was carried into the post-flood world, forms the foundation of the wisdom he passes to Gilgamesh. The Sumerian version calls the survivor Ziusudra, life of long days, and describes him as exceptionally pious, yes, but also as one who sought out wisdom and who possessed knowledge of the divine me. Before the flood, Ziusudra is presented as someone actively pursuing divine knowledge, not just receiving it passively. He's investigating, learning, assembling understanding of how the cosmos works. When Enki warns him, he's warning someone who has been preparing for exactly this kind of cosmic information, someone who has built the conceptual frameworks necessary to understand and act on divine revelation. What this means is that the flood, intended to reset human civilization, instead preserved and concentrated human knowledge. Of all humans, the ones most knowledgeable, most wise, most aware of divine operations were selected for survival. The post-flood world didn't start from zero, but from the peak of pre-flood human achievement. Everything Atrahasis or Utnapishtim or Ziusudra knew, all the accumulated wisdom and technical skill and understanding of cosmic patterns, survived in them and was transmitted to their descendants. The gods must have understood this. They're not presented as stupid or unaware. Enlil's anger when he discovers humans survived suggests he recognized immediately that the reset had failed, that Enki's intervention had preserved exactly what the flood was meant to eliminate. But by then it was too late. The survivors had already disembarked, the world was already being repopulated, and destroying humanity again would just repeat the same cycle, especially if Enki would intervene again. So, instead, the gods impose new limitations. In the Atrahasis, after the flood, the gods create categories of women who cannot bear children, institute infant mortality, impose lifespans much shorter than the pre-flood period. These are biological and social limitations meant to prevent humanity from returning to pre-flood population and capability levels. But they're partial measures, compromises, adjustments rather than solutions. Humanity is allowed to continue, but under stricter constraints, more carefully managed. Yet even these constraints carry within them the seeds of their own failure. By preserving human knowledge through the flood survivors, the gods ensured that we would rebuild, relearn, rediscover, eventually approach again whatever threshold the flood was meant to prevent us from crossing. The flood survivor becomes the bottleneck through which all pre-flood knowledge passes, concentrated and preserved. And that knowledge, carried forward, becomes the foundation of every subsequent human achievement. There's a tablet in the British Museum, catalogue number BM 4623, containing a fragment of the Gilgamesh flood narrative with an unusual addition. After Utnapishtim finishes telling the flood story, there's a damaged section where Gilgamesh apparently asks what knowledge the pre-flood world possessed. Utnapishtim's response is fragmentary, but surviving phrases include the patterns of heaven, the names of power, and the ways to speak to the deep. These are not agricultural techniques or practical crafts, but what sounds like esoteric knowledge, understanding of cosmic structures, and perhaps techniques for interacting with divine or fundamental forces. And this knowledge, Utnapishtim implies, survived the flood in his memory. The flood narratives thus contain a profound irony. The gods sent the flood to eliminate problematic human development, but by allowing any survivors, especially wise survivors, they guaranteed that development would continue. The knowledge couldn't be erased without erasing its bearers, and erasing all bearers would mean no post-flood humanity at all. Enki forced the gods into a compromise: either accept total human extinction or accept that human knowledge would persist. The gods chose persistence, but they chose it knowing, they must have known, that they were choosing eventual return to the same problems that had made the flood necessary in the first place. In the archaeological site of ancient Nippur, religious center of Sumer, excavators working in the 1950s through the 1980s recovered tens of thousands of tablet fragments from the temple complexes. Most were administrative records, hymns, omens, and copies of well-known literary works. But a small percentage, perhaps 2 or 3 dozen tablets, contain what Assyriologists call unclassified mythological material, texts that reference familiar characters and settings but tell unfamiliar stories or present familiar stories with unfamiliar details. These tablets are rarely published, sitting instead in specialist journals or unpublished dissertation appendices. One such fragment, published in a 1987 article by Miguel Civil, contains a dialogue between Enlil and an unnamed human petitioner. The human is asking for something, and Enlil's response, fragmentary but clear, includes the phrase, "You have become as we are," not as praise, but as accusation. Nippur was excavated over multiple seasons by teams from the University of Pennsylvania and the Oriental Institute of Chicago, beginning in the 1880s and continuing, with interruptions, through the late 20th century. The site was massive, layers upon layers of temples and archives spanning over 3,000 years of occupation. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur was the religious center of Sumer, the place where cosmic authority was thought to reside, where the Tablet of Destinies was kept, where the Divine Council met to decree fates. The excavators found tablets everywhere. Storage rooms packed with administrative records, libraries of literary texts, schoolrooms littered with student practice tablets, private houses containing personal archives. Most were catalogued, photographed, and eventually published in the ongoing series of volumes documenting Nippur's cuneiform holdings. But some tablets, particularly fragmentary ones containing unfamiliar content, were set aside for specialist analysis, assigned to graduate students or junior scholars who might have time to work through difficult, incomplete texts that wouldn't contribute to the major research questions driving the excavations. Miguel Civil, a Spanish-American Assyriologist who spent decades working through Nippur materials, published numerous small articles about these marginal tablets. The 1987 article appeared in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, a brief note about 3 unrelated tablet fragments from Nippur's Enlil Temple archive. 2 of the fragments were mundane, damaged copies of known hymns. The third was the dialogue fragment. The tablet itself is small, perhaps 1/4 of an original composition, preserving parts of 11 lines. The beginning and ending are lost. What survives is the middle of an exchange between Enlil and a human whose name is broken away. The human is speaking first, in the preserved portion, asking Enlil for something. The request itself is in a damaged section, but the phrasing that survives includes words relating to knowledge or wisdom and what might be permission or access. Then Enlil responds, and his response is angry. The Sumerian phrasing is terse, as liturgical language often is, but Civil's translation renders Enlil's key line as, "You have become as we are, and this was not the design." Alternative translations are possible. The verb could mean, "You have made yourselves," rather than, "You have become," suggesting human agency rather than passive development. The phrase, "as we are," could alternatively be "in our image" or "with our capacities," and the design could be the intent or the pattern or the plan, but the basic accusatory structure remains across any plausible translation. Humans have achieved or acquired something that makes them similar to gods, and this was not supposed to happen. The human's response to this accusation is lost to damage. The next surviving lines show Enlil pronouncing some kind of decree or limitation, but the specific content is unclear. The text breaks off mid-sentence, and whatever resolution or consequence followed is gone, lost to the thousands of years between this tablet's creation and its fragmentary survival. Civil's article treats the fragment as interesting but ultimately uninterpretable without more context. He notes the unusual phrasing, compares it to similar accusations in other mythological texts, suggests it might be part of a larger narrative about divine human boundaries, and moves on. The article is 4 pages long. The fragment gets 2 paragraphs. In the decades since publication, the fragment has been cited perhaps half a dozen times in specialist literature, mostly in footnotes, mostly as a curiosity. But that phrase haunts. "You have become as we are." And this was not the design. It's the mythological anxiety made explicit, the fear underlying all the flood narratives and limitation strategies and divine withdrawals. Humans were designed for one purpose, to serve as laborers, and we became something else. We developed capabilities, acquired knowledge, achieved a status approaching divinity. We exceeded our specifications, surpassed our design parameters, became something that makes us uncomfortably similar to the gods themselves. The fragment doesn't tell us what specific human achievement prompted this accusation. It doesn't tell us what limitation Enlil imposed in response. It doesn't tell us whether the human accepted Enlil's decree or continued to push against divine boundaries. All of that context is lost. What survives is just the accusation itself, preserved in baked clay pressed with cuneiform marks over 4,000 years ago, sitting now in a museum storage facility, catalogued and filed and largely forgotten, waiting for someone to recognize its significance. One of the stranger recurring motifs in Mesopotamian mythology is divine concern with human reproduction. In the Atrahasis, before the flood, the gods attempt to limit human population, not just through catastrophe, but through biological means. They create infertility, they establish categories of women who cannot bear children, they institute infant mortality. The text presents this as response to overpopulation, but the details are oddly specific and invasive, as if the gods were trying to biologically engineer humanity into a more manageable form. After the flood, these limitations are instituted more formally, built into the structure of post-flood humanity. What this suggests is that human fertility, our capacity to reproduce and multiply, was itself seen as threatening, as if there were a dangerous correlation between our numbers and something else, some capacity or capability that scaled with population size. The Atrahasis epic, in its most complete version preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE, describes a sequence of divine interventions against human population. First, the gods send plague, but Enki teaches humans to focus their worship on the plague deity. Then the gods send drought, cutting off rain for 3 years, but again Enki intervenes with countermeasures. These attempts at population control through disaster fail because Enki subverts them. So the gods try something different, something more permanent. The text describes the creation of what it calls categories of women. The Sumerian and Akkadian terminology is specific and disturbing. There is the Ugbabtu, a category of woman who is forbidden to bear children, perhaps a kind of priestess class required to remain celibate, or perhaps women who are physiologically prevented from conception. There is the Entu, another priestly category bound to the temple and prohibited from motherhood. And there is the demon Pasitu, who is assigned the role of taking infants, instituting infant mortality as a permanent feature of human existence. These are not temporary measures but structural changes to human biology and society. The gods are trying to engineer humanity into a form where population growth is naturally limited, where not all women can reproduce, where not all children survive infancy. The text presents this as divine wisdom, as necessary management of human numbers, but the specificity of the interventions suggests something more targeted, more deliberate than simple population control. Why would the gods care so much about human numbers? The standard reading says that human overpopulation threatened food supplies, created noise and disruption, made it difficult for gods to receive sufficient sacrifices from an overstretched civilization. But this explanation struggles with the details. The gods don't just reduce population through disaster and then move on. They try to permanently alter human reproductive capacity to build limitation into our very biology. This suggests that human numbers themselves were threatening, not just the consequences of overpopulation. One possibility, rarely discussed in mainstream scholarship but whispered in specialist circles, is that human capability scales with population size, not linearly, but in some more complex way, where larger populations generate more knowledge, more innovation, more individuals with exceptional abilities, more opportunities for humans to exceed our designed parameters. Small populations of humans, scattered and isolated, would remain manageable, limited by the practical constraints of their numbers. But large populations, concentrated in cities, communicating and coordinating and building on each other's innovations, might develop capabilities that approach or even threaten divine supremacy. This would explain the specificity of the gods' reproductive interventions. They're not just trying to reduce numbers, but to prevent the kind of population density and growth that enables rapid cultural and technical development. By instituting permanent infertility in some women, by creating religious roles that remove women from reproductive pools, by ensuring high infant mortality, the gods are trying to keep human populations below whatever threshold enables the most threatening forms of human capability. The text is explicit that these measures are instituted after the flood, as permanent features of the post-flood human condition. The flood survivors are told, "This is how things will be from now on. Not all women will bear children. Not all children will survive. Human fertility is constrained, limited, managed. These are the new rules of the reset cosmos, the boundaries within which humanity must operate." But even these measures seem inadequate. The Atrahasis ends with human civilization rebuilding, cities rising again, populations growing despite the limitations. The constraints slow human development but don't stop it. Within generations, humans are again numerous enough, sophisticated enough, to constitute whatever concern prompted the flood in the first place. The gods have bought time, imposed friction, but they haven't solved the fundamental problem of human potential. There's a medical text from the Neo-Assyrian period, around 700 BCE, that contains instructions for preventing conception and for inducing abortion. The text is practical. clinical, listing herbs and techniques with the matter-of-fact tone of technical literature. But the introduction to this section contains an unusual phrase: knowledge given by the gods to limit what grows too numerous. The phrasing suggests that contraceptive and abortifacient knowledge was understood as divinely sanctioned population control, as if the gods had provided humans with the tools to limit our own numbers, ensuring we would regulate ourselves in ways the gods found acceptable. This creates an odd circularity. The gods limit human reproduction through biological and social engineering, then provide humans with additional knowledge to further limit our own reproduction, as if double-checking that we won't exceed sustainable numbers. The anxiety about human population runs through multiple layers of mythological and medical tradition, suggesting it was a genuine and persistent concern rather than a narrative convenience. The question remains, why? What is it about human numbers that so consistently alarms the divine powers? The mythology never quite answers this directly, but the pattern is clear. Small populations of humans are acceptable, even useful. Large populations trigger divine intervention. The threshold is never specified, but it exists, and crossing it repeatedly brings catastrophe followed by limitation, as if the gods are trying to find exactly the right level of human population, numerous enough to serve divine needs, but not so numerous that we become something else, something dangerous. The Sumerian city of Uruk, archaeological layers dating back to 4000 BCE, has always occupied an ambiguous place in Mesopotamian mythology. It's the city of Gilgamesh, but it's also repeatedly described as a place where divine authority is contested, where humans push boundaries, where the relationship between heaven and earth becomes complicated. In one fragmentary text, Uruk is called the city that questions heaven, and Inanna, its patron goddess, is portrayed not as a stern ruler, but as an advocate for her people against the other gods. There's a suggestion in these texts that certain cities cultivated a particular relationship with the divine, more adversarial, more questioning, and that these cities became centers of knowledge and power that made the Anunnaki nervous. Uruk's massive temple complexes were not just sites of worship but institutions of learning, calculation, and ambition. Uruk was enormous by the standards of the ancient world. At its peak in the 3rd millennium BCE, the city covered perhaps 6 square kilometers, enclosed by a wall that the Epic of Gilgamesh describes in loving detail. Its foundations of fired brick, its towers and gates, its circuit of 9 kilometers that Gilgamesh himself supposedly built. The archaeological reality matches the mythological descriptions surprisingly well. The walls existed, massive constructions requiring coordinated labor of thousands, the kind of project that demonstrates sophisticated social organization and technical capability. But it's the temple complexes that reveal Uruk's real significance. The Inanna district, sacred precinct of Inanna, contains some of the earliest monumental architecture in human history. Temple platforms built and rebuilt over centuries, each new structure grander than the last, decorated with cone mosaics in geometric patterns, oriented to celestial alignments. The White Temple, the Limestone Temple, the Anu Ziggurat, structures that announce to anyone approaching from the flat Mesopotamian plain that something unprecedented was happening here, that humans were building on a scale and with an ambition that approached divine architecture. The German Archaeological Institute excavated Uruk extensively in the 20th century, recovering tens of thousands of tablets from various periods. What emerges from these tablets is a picture of Uruk as not just a city, but a civilizational experiment, a place where humans were systematically pushing the boundaries of what cities could be and do. The earliest writing appears in Uruk, pictographic symbols evolving into cuneiform script. The earliest mathematical notation appears here. The first large-scale irrigation management systems. The first centralized bureaucracy capable of coordinating thousands of workers on multi-generational building projects. In mythology, Uruk is Inanna's city, and Inanna is perhaps the most complicated deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. She's goddess of love and war, of fertility and destruction, of the morning and evening star. She steals the Mi from Enki and brings them to Uruk. She descends to the underworld and returns. She raises kings and destroys them. And in her relationship with Uruk, she's portrayed as fiercely protective, willing to challenge other gods on behalf of her city. There's a fragmentary text, published in pieces across multiple articles in the 1960s and 70s, that describes a conflict between Inanna and Enlil over Uruk's status. Enlil wants to limit Uruk's growth, to reduce its population, to restrict the knowledge being accumulated in its temple libraries. Inanna refuses. The text is badly damaged, but surviving portions show Inanna arguing that Uruk represents humanity's potential, that limiting Uruk would be limiting what humans could become, and that this would violate some principle or promise the text doesn't preserve clearly. Enlil backs down, but the text describes him as resentful, waiting for an opportunity to impose his will. This mythology of Uruk as a protected space of human development, defended by its patron goddess against divine attempts at limitation, appears in multiple contexts. In the Gilgamesh epic, when Ishtar, the Akkadian form of Inanna, sends the bull of heaven against Uruk, it's because Gilgamesh has rejected her advances. But the bull's purpose is explicitly to destroy the city, to kill hundreds or thousands of its people. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull instead, they're defending Uruk against divine attack, protecting the city's population and knowledge base. The gods punish this by killing Enkidu, but Uruk itself survives, its people intact, its institutions continuing. The phrase, "the city that questions heaven," appears in a wisdom text from the Old Babylonian period, part of a larger catalogue of cities and their characteristics. Most cities are described by their products or their geography. Nippur, city of holy authority. Eridu, city where the Mi reside. Babylon, city of gates. But Uruk is the city that questions heaven, as if questioning, challenging divine authority or divine knowledge is its defining feature. What would it mean for a city to question heaven? Not individual humans questioning occasionally, but a city, an entire urban civilization, maintaining a culture of questioning as its central identity. It would mean institutions dedicated to investigation, to testing claims. It would mean scribal schools teaching not just obedience to tradition but critical thinking about tradition. It would mean temple libraries containing not just received wisdom but experimental knowledge, observations that contradict divine teachings, calculations that reveal patterns the gods supposedly control. Uruk's scribal schools produced student exercises that survive by the thousands. Many are standard. Copy this hymn, memorize this list, practice your handwriting. But some are different. Mathematical problems with no practical application, designed to test abstract reasoning, astronomical observations recorded without religious interpretation, raw data about planetary movements, disputation texts where students argue both sides of a question. These are the products of an educational system teaching people to think, to question, to investigate, not just to obey and copy. The gods' nervousness about Uruk, preserved in fragmentary myths and oblique references, makes sense if Uruk represented a tipping point, a place where human knowledge and ambition were concentrating to dangerous levels, where the culture of questioning was producing individuals and institutions that could genuinely challenge divine authority. Inanna's protection of the city becomes, in this reading, her recognition that Uruk was doing something important, something worth defending even against other gods, something that represented humanity's best chance at exceeding our designed limitations. And Uruk succeeded. For over 3,000 years, it remained a center of learning, innovation, and civilization. Long after the Sumerian language died, long after the old kingdoms fell, its libraries and schools producing generation after generation of scribes and scholars who preserved and extended the knowledge the city had accumulated. When Uruk finally declined in the early centuries of the Common Era, it was not because the gods destroyed it, but because trade routes shifted, because political centers moved elsewhere. The city that questioned heaven survived every divine attempt at limitation and fell only to the mundane forces of economics and geography. 20th century excavations of Mesopotamian mathematical tablets revealed a sophistication that shocked archaeologists. The Babylonians worked in base 60 mathematics, used something approaching the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras, calculated square roots and cube roots, understood geometric series, and produced tables of reciprocals and multiplication that demonstrate abstract mathematical thinking far beyond practical necessity. The French mathematician Christine Proust, studying these tablets, noted that many contain mathematical knowledge that has no obvious practical application, problems that seem designed purely to explore mathematical relationships. This is recreational mathematics, theoretical investigation, the kind of thinking that suggests not merely practical calculation but genuine curiosity about the abstract structures of reality. And in Sumerian mythology, the god of mathematics and measurement is Nisaba, a goddess whose symbols include the stylus and tablet, who was said to open the ears of those who could understand the deep patterns of things. The mathematical tablets come from various sites and periods, but the greatest concentration was found at Nippur, in the scribal school attached to the temple complex. Thousands of tablets, ranging from basic multiplication tables written by beginning students to advanced problem texts that would challenge modern mathematicians. The cuneiform number system, base 60, is still with us in our 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes. In our 360-degree circles, remnants of Babylonian mathematical thinking embedded in our own measurement systems. What shocked the 20th century scholars who first seriously studied these tablets was not just the sophistication but the abstraction. These weren't just practical calculations for measuring fields or calculating grain yields. These were mathematical problems pursued for their own sake, explorations of numerical relationships that had no immediate practical application. One tablet, known as Plimpton 322, dating to around 1800 BCE, contains a list of Pythagorean triples, sets of three numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the fundamental relationship of right triangles. But the numbers are huge, far beyond any practical construction project, and the list is systematic, generated by a formula suggesting the scribe understood the abstract mathematical principle underlying the specific examples. Another tablet contains what modern mathematicians recognize as an algorithm for calculating square roots, a systematic procedure that produces approximations of irrational numbers to several decimal places. The tablet doesn't explain why this is useful, doesn't connect it to any practical application, just presents the procedure as interesting mathematical knowledge. This is pure mathematics, investigation of numerical structures for the sake of understanding, exactly the kind of abstract thinking that characterizes advanced mathematical culture. Christine Proust, working through tablets from Nippur and other sites in the early 21st century, identified multiple examples of what she calls mathematical recreations, problems designed not to solve practical issues, but to explore mathematical possibilities. Geometric puzzles about dividing irregular shapes, number games about finding sequences with particular properties, algebraic problems about unknown quantities related in complex ways. These tablets were found in scribal schools, suggesting this recreational mathematics was part of the curriculum, that students were being taught to think about numbers and shapes abstractly, to see mathematics as a domain of knowledge worth exploring for its own sake. This is extraordinary in historical context. Most ancient civilizations developed mathematics for practical purposes, measuring land, tracking astronomical cycles for calendars, calculating taxes, planning construction projects. Mathematics was a tool, developed and taught insofar as it served immediate practical needs. But Babylonian mathematics went beyond utility into theory, into investigation of mathematical structures and relationships regardless of practical application. This represents a different kind of thinking, a recognition that mathematical patterns reveal something fundamental about reality, something worth understanding even without immediate use. In Sumerian mythology, the goddess Nisaba presides over mathematics, writing, and measurement. She's described as the one who knows the deep secrets of numbers, who reveals the patterns hidden in the cosmos, who opens the ears of the wise. This last phrase is significant in Mesopotamian idiom. Opening the ears means enabling understanding, making someone capable of perceiving and comprehending what was previously obscure. Nisaba opens the ears of those who study mathematics, allowing them to perceive the deep patterns, the underlying structures of reality that numbers and geometric relationships reveal. There's a hymn to Nisaba, preserved in multiple copies from different periods, that describes her as teaching humans to see what the gods know through measuring and counting. The phrasing suggests that mathematical knowledge provides access to divine understanding, that by mastering calculation and geometry, humans can perceive the same cosmic patterns the gods use to structure reality. This is dangerous knowledge, knowledge that collapses the distance between human and divine cognition, that makes humans capable of understanding the mechanisms by which the cosmos operates. And the Babylonians pursued this knowledge systematically, across centuries, building tables and developing procedures, and training generations of scribes in abstract mathematical thinking. They created a mathematical culture, a community of scholars who shared problems and solutions, who built on each other's work, who understood themselves to be investigating something profound and fundamental. The tablets preserve not just individual solutions, but collaborative intellectual work, with different scribes' approaches to the same problem showing up across multiple tablets, suggesting comparison and discussion and refinement of mathematical techniques. What were they doing with this knowledge? Beyond the practical applications of calendar making and land measurement, what was the purpose of calculating square roots to 5 decimal places, or generating Pythagorean triples into the hundreds of thousands, or exploring geometric series with no connection to architecture or engineering? The tablets don't say. They just present the mathematics, clean and pure, as if the knowledge itself were justification enough. But in the context of divine anxiety about human capability, Babylonian mathematics looks like exactly the kind of development that would alarm the gods. Humans were learning to perceive the underlying patterns of reality, to manipulate abstract structures, to understand the numerical relationships that govern cosmic order. We were, in effect, learning to see reality the way the gods see it, through mathematical relationships and geometric patterns. And if the gods' authority depends partly on humans not understanding how the cosmos is structured, then every mathematical tablet, every scribal student learning to calculate square roots, every problem text exploring numerical relationships was a small erosion of divine monopoly on cosmic knowledge. The Sumerians tracked celestial movements with precision that, according to some historians of science, exceeds what their naked eye observations should have allowed. They identified and named planets, tracked lunar cycles with accuracy that required intergenerational data collection, and developed a calendar system that balanced solar and lunar time with remarkable sophistication. But more unsettling are the Sumerian astronomical texts that reference celestial events that wouldn't be visible from Mesopotamia, that describe phenomena requiring instruments or techniques we have no evidence they possessed. The Assyriologist Hermann Hunger, compiling Babylonian astronomical diaries, noted several references to observations that imply knowledge of celestial mechanics not demonstrated elsewhere in the corpus. These are not errors, but accurate descriptions of things they shouldn't have been able to describe. Which raises the obvious question: where did this knowledge come from? Mesopotamian astronomy is documented across thousands of tablets spanning over 2 millennia. The earliest astronomical texts are observational, recording the positions of Venus, the phases of the moon, the appearances and disappearances of planets against the stellar background. These observations were connected to omens, to predictions about weather and harvests and royal fortunes. The gods were thought to communicate through celestial signs, so watching the sky was religious duty as much as scientific investigation. But over centuries, the observations became more systematic, more precise, more detached from immediate omen interpretation. By the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods, 7th through 4th centuries BCE, astronomical scribes were maintaining detailed diaries of celestial events, recording night after night of planetary positions, lunar phases, eclipse timings, stellar configurations. These diaries were not just data collection, but the foundation for predictive astronomy, for developing mathematical models that could forecast future celestial events with surprising accuracy. The accuracy is what puzzles modern historians of science. To predict lunar eclipses, for instance, requires understanding the 18-year Saros cycle, the period after which eclipse patterns repeat. The Babylonians knew this cycle, used it for predictions, but discovering it requires tracking eclipses over multiple generations, compiling data systematically, analyzing patterns across decades. This is institutional knowledge, accumulated by communities of observers who maintained records across generations and built mathematical models from aggregated data. But some tablets describe things that shouldn't be visible. There are references to planetary positions that would require observations at times when the planets were too close to the sun to see with naked eyes. There are descriptions of stellar configurations that would only be visible from different latitudes. There are calculations of planetary periods that match modern astronomical values more closely than naked eye observation alone should permit. Hermann Hunger, publishing the Babylonian astronomical diaries across multiple volumes in the late 20th century, noted these anomalies in his commentary, but couldn't explain them satisfactorily. One tablet, part of the MUL-APIN series, a compendium of astronomical knowledge compiled around 1000 BCE, contains a description of Venus's synodic period, the time it takes Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun and Earth, calculated as 584 days. Modern astronomy puts the value at 583.92 days. The Babylonian figure is accurate to within a fraction of a percent, an extraordinary precision for naked eye observation spanning the time periods available to Babylonian astronomers. Where did this number come from? The standard answer is patient observation across centuries, careful record keeping, mathematical analysis of patterns, and certainly the Babylonians did all of this. The astronomical diaries demonstrate systematic observation and analysis. But some scholars, usually carefully, in footnotes or oblique phrasing, suggest the possibility of inherited knowledge, that Babylonian astronomy might have built on older traditions, older observations, perhaps even older mathematical models whose origins are lost to historical record. There's a text, fragmentary and controversial, that describes astronomical knowledge as part of the me, the divine powers stolen or given to humanity. The text lists various me and includes among them knowledge of the heavenly paths, understanding of the star names, and calculation of the time circles. This suggests that at least some Mesopotamian thinkers understood astronomy as originally divine knowledge, something humans acquired from or through divine sources, rather than developing entirely through their own observations. but acquired or developed, Babylonian astronomy represents humans systematically investigating the cosmos, building mathematical models of celestial mechanics, learning to predict the movements of planets and stars with precision that approaches modern accuracy. This is humans understanding the machinery of heaven, perceiving the mathematical laws that govern celestial motion, the exact kind of knowledge that Mesopotamian mythology treats as potentially threatening to divine authority. And the astronomical knowledge was practical in ways that mathematics wasn't always. Predicting eclipses meant understanding celestial mechanics well enough to forecast events months or years in advance. This was power, the ability to know what the gods would supposedly reveal through celestial signs before the signs appeared, to predict rather than merely observe divine communication. For a culture that treated celestial events as divine messages, the ability to predict those events mathematically suggested that divine messages followed predictable, natural laws, that heaven operated by mechanisms humans could understand and model. The temples controlled astronomical knowledge carefully. Observational platforms on ziggurat tops were restricted spaces. Astronomical tablets were often classified as secret knowledge, kept in temple archives rather than circulated publicly. The scribes who maintained the astronomical diaries were highly trained specialists, part of scholarly lineages that passed knowledge from master to student across generations. This was valuable, dangerous knowledge, and the institutions that controlled it understood it needed to be managed, protected, limited in its circulation. Yet even with these controls, astronomical knowledge spread and deepened. Each generation of observers added to the accumulated data. Each generation of calculators refined the mathematical models. Over centuries, Babylonian astronomy achieved a sophistication that wouldn't be matched in the West until the Renaissance. 1,000 years after the last cuneiform astronomical diary was written, humans watching the sky, tracking patterns, building models, understanding the cosmos through mathematics and observation, exactly the trajectory Mesopotamian mythology suggests the gods feared, humanity learning to see reality as it actually is, stripped of divine mystery, revealed as a system of natural laws we could comprehend and predict. The great temple complexes of Sumer were not just religious centers, but repositories of knowledge, proto-universities where scribes trained for years in literacy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. The curriculum, preserved in what are called school texts, shows a systematic education designed to produce not just functionally literate bureaucrats, but individuals capable of abstract thought and technical mastery. The temples controlled this knowledge tightly, with scribal schools operating almost as guilds, passing down information across generations. What's anthropologically significant is that this knowledge was considered sacred, protected, dangerous. Tablets were stored in secured rooms, access was restricted, and certain texts were explicitly marked as secret knowledge of the temple. The temples were not just preserving knowledge but containing it, as if information itself were a substance that needed careful handling. The scribal schools, called Eduba in Sumerian, literally tablet house, were attached to major temples and produced the literate elite who ran Mesopotamian civilization. Training began young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, and continued for years, over a decade for those pursuing advanced specializations. The curriculum survives in thousands of student practice tablets, exercises copying standard texts, solving mathematical problems, practicing proper cuneiform style, but the curriculum was more than rote memorization. Students learned to read and write in both Sumerian and Akkadian, to work with complex mathematical problems, to interpret omens, to draft legal documents, to compose hymns and letters. They studied literature, memorizing the great mythological epics and wisdom texts. They learned music and ritual performance. By the end of their training, successful students were capable of functioning as temple administrators, royal scribes, teachers, legal experts, medical practitioners, or astronomers. They were, in effect, the intellectual elite of their civilization. The German scholar Nikolaus Schneider, studying Mesopotamian education in the early 20th century, reconstructed the Aduba curriculum from surviving school texts. What struck him was how theoretical much of the education was, how much emphasis was placed on abstract knowledge rather than immediate practical skills. Students spent years studying literary texts that had no administrative function, solving mathematical problems with no connection to real surveying or accounting tasks, memorizing lists of plants and stones and stars beyond any practical necessity. This was education for the sake of knowledge, training minds to think abstractly, to recognize patterns, to manipulate complex information. The temples housed libraries containing not just administrative archives but collected literary, scientific, and religious texts. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, though Assyrian rather than Sumerian, gives us a model of what temple libraries contained. Thousands of tablets organized by subject, catalogued, and cross-referenced, maintained by specialized librarian scribes. The library contained medical texts, astronomical tables, omen collections, mathematical problem sets, mythological epics, historical chronicles, diplomatic correspondence, everything the intellectual culture had accumulated. Access to these libraries was restricted. Not all scribes could enter the inner archives. Certain texts were marked as secret, intended only for initiated specialists. The archaeologist Samuel Kramer, excavating at Nippur and working through its temple archives, noted that tablets marked as secret were often stored in separate rooms, sometimes in clay jars or sealed containers, suggesting they were considered particularly sensitive. What made certain knowledge secret? What categories of understanding were too dangerous for general circulation? Some secret texts were clearly ritual instructions, procedures for temple ceremonies that needed to be performed correctly and weren't meant for public knowledge. But others were scientific or mathematical, astronomical calculations or medical procedures or mathematical techniques that had no obvious ritual function. These were marked secret not because they were religiously sensitive, but because they were considered dangerous knowledge, understanding that could be misused, or that challenged divine authority, or that granted too much power to whoever possessed it. There's a catalogue of tablets from the Temple of Shamash at Sippar, compiled around 1500 BCE, that lists library holdings with brief descriptions. Most entries are straightforward: hymns to Shamash, omen series concerning liver divination, mathematical table of reciprocals. But some entries are marked with a special symbol, and the catalogue notes these are to be shown only to the purified, meaning scribes who had undergone special initiation, who had been deemed trustworthy and capable of handling sensitive information. What information qualified as too sensitive for ordinary scribes? The catalogue doesn't specify, but other evidence suggests categories: advanced astronomical knowledge that might enable prediction of celestial events, medical knowledge about poisons or abortifacients, mathematical techniques that revealed cosmic patterns, texts describing the nature of the gods themselves, temple archives containing diplomatic or political secrets. The boundary between sacred and secret was blurry, but the key principle was clear. Not all knowledge should circulate freely. Some understanding needed to be restricted, contained, controlled. This created a two-tier system of knowledge. Public knowledge, available to anyone with scribal training, included basic literacy and numeracy, standard mythological texts, ordinary legal and administrative procedures, commonly available medical treatments, basic astronomical observations for calendar purposes. Secret knowledge, restricted to initiated specialists, included advanced mathematics and astronomy, esoteric medical procedures, detailed astronomical tables, texts describing divine nature and cosmic structure. Advanced ritual practices. The temples functioned as gatekeepers, deciding who could access which knowledge, ensuring that the most powerful or dangerous understanding remained within trusted lineages of specialists. Yet the system was imperfect. Knowledge leaked. Students who learned secret techniques sometimes left temple service and used their knowledge independently. Tablets were copied, sometimes without the secret markings being transferred. Wars and conquests scattered temple libraries, their contents absorbed into new archives where the old restrictions might not be maintained. Over centuries, knowledge that began as temple secrets became more widely available, diffusing through the literate classes, creating communities of scholars outside direct temple control. And always there was the tension between preserving knowledge and containing it. The temples needed to train new generations of scribes to maintain their institutional functions, but training scribes meant sharing knowledge, and shared knowledge became harder to control. The more people who understood advanced mathematics or astronomy or medicine, the less the temples could restrict how that knowledge was used. The scribal schools, designed to preserve and control knowledge, became engines of knowledge diffusion, creating larger and larger communities of educated individuals who possessed understanding the temples would have preferred to keep restricted. By the late Babylonian period, the secret knowledge of earlier eras had become scholarly knowledge, discussed and debated among networks of scribes who maintained intellectual correspondence across cities. The temples still controlled formal education and library access, but they could no longer fully contain what they had created. A literate, educated class that possessed powerful knowledge and understood that knowledge represented power, independence, the capacity to understand and potentially manipulate the structures of reality the gods supposedly controlled exclusively. Sometime in the late 3rd millennium BCE, a shift occurs in Mesopotamian religious texts. The gods, who in earlier texts interact directly and frequently with humans, begin to withdraw. They communicate through omens and dreams rather than face-to-face encounters. They act through intermediaries, through priests and kings rather than direct intervention. The Lament for Ur, composed after the city's destruction around 2000 BCE, describes the gods abandoning their temples and cities, rising like birds to heaven and leaving humanity to fend for itself against catastrophe. The text treats this as tragedy, but there's another way to read it. As a strategic retreat, as if the gods realized that continued close contact with humanity was becoming untenable, that we had learned too much, grown too capable, and the safest course was distance. From the gods' perspective, the age of direct divine rule was ending not because humans were ready for independence, but because we were becoming too dangerous to manage up close. In the earliest Sumerian myths, dating to the 3rd millennium BCE, gods walk the earth regularly. They visit their temples, they speak directly to kings, they intervene personally in human affairs. Inanna walks through Uruk's streets. Enki teaches humans from his temple at Eridu. Enlil pronounces judgments face to face with petitioners. The boundary between divine and human realms is permeable, crossable, maintained more by protocol than by unbridgeable separation. Gods and humans occupy the same physical space, interact in ways that suggest proximity and accessibility. But by the early 2nd millennium, the mythology has changed. Gods remain in heaven, sending messages through dreams and omens. When they need to communicate with humans, they appear in visions or speak through prophets rather than manifesting physically. When they intervene in human affairs, they work through natural forces, through storms and plagues and military defeats, rather than direct personal action. The age of gods walking among humans is ending, remembered in the old stories but no longer part of contemporary experience. The Lament for Ur captures this transition in devastating poetry. The city of Ur has been destroyed by Elamite invasion around 2004 BCE, its population killed or scattered, its temples burned. The text describes the city's patron goddess, Ningal, pleading with the divine council to spare but the gods have already decided. And then, before the destruction comes, the gods leave. They abandon their temples, rising to heaven like birds, leaving their earthly dwellings empty. The city is destroyed not while the gods watch helplessly, but after they have already withdrawn. As if divine presence has been deliberately removed before the catastrophe. The imagery is striking. Gods rising like birds, departing, ascending to heaven and not returning. The text presents this as abandonment, as the gods forsaking their beloved city. And certainly from Ur's perspective it was abandonment. But there's another reading available if you shift perspective to the divine viewpoint. What if the withdrawal was not about specifically, but about a larger pattern? A decision to reduce direct divine presence in human affairs, to establish distance and separation where previously there had been proximity and interaction. Why would the gods choose to withdraw? The standard religious reading says that humanity had become too sinful, too corrupt, unworthy of direct divine presence. But this doesn't align well with the actual content of the myths. The gods withdraw not after some great human moral failure, but during a period of unprecedented human achievement. The height of Sumerian civilization, when cities are largest, when literacy is spreading, when mathematical and astronomical knowledge is advancing rapidly. The withdrawal correlates with human capability, not human failure. The strategic retreat reading suggests the gods recognized that continued close contact with increasingly capable humans was becoming problematic. Every interaction was an opportunity for humans to observe divine behavior, to learn divine knowledge, to perceive the mechanisms by which gods operated. Close contact meant humans could study the gods, could develop understanding of divine nature and divine power. Distance meant mystery could be maintained. Divine authority could be preserved through inaccessibility rather than demonstrated superiority. There's a hymn from the Ur-3 period, around 2100 BCE, that describes Enlil's decision to raise his dwelling to the heights of heaven, away from the noise and the questioning. Not rebellion, not disobedience, but questioning. The human tendency to ask why and how, to seek understanding rather than simply accepting divine decree. The gods are withdrawing from human questions, from the intellectual pressure of humans who want to understand rather than merely obey. The shift to omen-based communication fits this pattern. Omens are ambiguous, requiring interpretation, always deniable. If a god speaks to you directly, and their prophecy fails, their authority is damaged. But if you interpret an omen incorrectly, the failure is yours, not the gods. Omen-based communication protects divine authority by making humans responsible for interpretation, by introducing sufficient ambiguity that divine messages can never be definitively wrong, and the withdrawal continues across subsequent centuries. By the first millennium BCE, direct divine appearances are rare, usually limited to dreams experienced by kings, always ambiguous, always filtered through human interpretation. The gods have receded to heaven, and the vast bureaucracy of priests and diviners and dream interpreters mediates all communication between divine and human realms. Direct contact is gone, replaced by institutionalized interpretation of indirect signs. This withdrawal served divine interests by maintaining mystery and authority through distance. But it also served human interests by creating space for human agency and investigation. With the gods no longer walking the earth, humans became responsible for managing civilization ourselves. We developed our own political systems, our own legal codes, our own scientific investigations of natural phenomena. The withdrawal of direct divine rule created the conditions for human independence, for the development of secular knowledge and secular power that didn't require constant divine oversight. The gods withdrew because continued proximity to humans had become too risky, too revealing, too likely to expose the mechanisms of divine power to human investigation. But in withdrawing, they ceded the earth to human management, creating exactly the conditions that would allow human knowledge and capability to advance without divine interference. The strategic retreat that was meant to preserve divine authority ultimately enabled human autonomy, the exact outcome the gods had spent millennia trying to prevent. Babylonian and Assyrian temple archives contain categories of texts marked as secret, often with explicit warnings that they are for the initiated or not to be shown to the uninformed. These texts cover topics including advanced divination techniques, medical procedures, astronomical calculations, and what appear to be theoretical discussions about the nature of the cosmos and divinity. When these tablets were finally translated in the 20th century, scholars were struck by how different these secret texts were from public religious literature. They were technical, speculative, almost philosophical, and they treated the gods not as inscrutable powers to worship, but as phenomena to analyze and understand. The priestly elite, it seems, maintained an esoteric tradition quite distinct from public religion, a body of knowledge that treated the divine as a system that could be studied, predicted, and perhaps even manipulated by those with sufficient understanding. The distinction between exoteric and esoteric religion appears across many cultures, but Mesopotamian temples made it explicit through physical markers on tablets. Secret texts carry warning colophons. Secret of the great gods. Initiated may show initiated. Uninitiated may not see. To be shown only to the purified scribe. These aren't metaphorical warnings, but practical instructions to librarian scribes about who should have access to which tablets, what made certain knowledge secret. When modern Assyriologists finally gained access to these marked tablets and translated them, they found content that challenged the assumption that ancient religion was purely about ritual observance and divine placation. These secret texts contained theoretical frameworks for understanding divine nature, astronomical calculations that revealed celestial mechanics, medical procedures that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human physiology, divination techniques that amounted to statistical analysis of patterns and probabilities. One category of secret texts, known as the Exorcist's Manual, contains not just ritual incantations, but theoretical discussions about the nature of demons and disease, about how supernatural afflictions work mechanistically, about the principles underlying effective treatment. These texts read less like religious scripture and more like medical theory, complete with diagnostic procedures, differential diagnosis between various afflictions, and systematic treatment protocols. The demons themselves are described in ways that suggest the priestly authors understood them as natural forces or disease processes, rather than literal supernatural entities. Using demonic language as a framework for discussing phenomena they recognized as following predictable patterns. Another category, astronomical texts marked as secret, contains not just observations but mathematical models of celestial mechanics. These tablets demonstrate that Babylonian astronomer priests understood planetary motion in terms of mathematical relationships, that they had developed geometric and arithmetic techniques for predicting celestial events, that they recognized the heavens operated according to discoverable laws rather than divine whim. The gods were associated with planets, yes, but the secret texts reveal that the priestly elite understood that these divine associations were symbolic or metaphorical, that the actual movements of celestial bodies followed mathematical patterns humans could model and predict. Perhaps most striking are the theological texts, rare and fragmentary, that appear to be priestly discussions about the nature of divinity itself. One such text, published in a 1968 article by the Assyriologist Wilfrid Lambert, contains a dialogue between two priests, debating whether the gods are immortal beings or personifications of natural forces. The text is incomplete, and the conclusion is lost, But the mere existence of such a debate among initiated priests suggests a level of theological speculation far beyond public religious practice. These priests were thinking critically about the nature of the gods they served, treating divinity as a question to investigate rather than a given to accept. The French scholar Jean Bottero, working through Babylonian religious texts in the late 20th century, argued that the secret tradition represented a kind of proto-rationalism, an attempt to understand the cosmos in systematic, almost scientific terms, while maintaining the religious framework necessary for temple function and social order. The priests lived in two intellectual worlds, the public world of ritual and worship and divine mystery, and the private world of investigation and theory and systematic understanding. The secret texts were the repository of this second world, the place where priests recorded their actual understanding of how things worked, as opposed to how public religion needed to present them. This created a profound tension. The priests who maintained the secret tradition understood that much of what they performed publicly was theatre, necessary social function but not literally true in the ways their congregations believed. They knew the gods didn't literally send specific omens, that omens were interpretive frameworks for discussing probabilities. They knew celestial events followed mathematical laws, not divine will. They knew medical treatments worked through natural mechanisms, not supernatural intervention. Yet they continued performing public rituals, delivering divine messages, maintaining the system because social order depended on public belief even as private knowledge contradicted that belief, and this knowledge was carefully restricted. The warnings on the tablets were not pro forma but genuine attempts to prevent circulation beyond initiated circles. Tablets were kept in locked rooms, access limited to priests who had undergone years of training and multiple initiations, who had proven themselves trustworthy members of the priestly lineage. The temples understood that this knowledge was dangerous, that if it circulated widely, if ordinary people understood that the priests themselves recognized the natural mechanisms underlying supposedly divine phenomena, religious authority would collapse. Yet over time, inevitably, the knowledge leaked. Some priests left temple service and took their knowledge with them. Some tablets were copied without the secret warnings being transferred. Foreign scholars who studied with Babylonian priests learned restricted knowledge and carried it to other cultures. By the Persian and Hellenistic periods, what had been secret temple knowledge was circulating among intellectual communities across the Near East and Mediterranean, becoming the foundation of Greek natural philosophy and scientific investigation. The secret tradition reveals that the most knowledgeable humans, the priestly elite who spent their lives studying divine texts and performing divine rituals, had come to understand the gods as natural forces, as patterns and systems that could be studied and predicted. They had demystified divinity while publicly maintaining mystery. They had achieved exactly what Mesopotamian mythology suggests the gods feared: human understanding of cosmic mechanics, human capability to predict and perhaps manipulate what was supposedly under exclusive divine control. And they had done this not through rebellion, but through systematic investigation, through generations of careful observation and theoretical development, through the intellectual work the temples themselves had established and maintained. In 2003, as the Iraq Museum was being looted in the chaos following the invasion of Baghdad, a curator named Nawala al-Mutawalli managed to hide several crates of tablets in a museum basement, covering them with old packing materials and false inventory labels. Among those tablets was one she had been quietly translating on her own time, a fragment that had arrived in the museum's collection in the 1970s with minimal provenance. The tablet contained a dialogue, she later told a colleague, between Enlil and an assembly of the Anunnaki, discussing the human problem. But the portion al-Mutawalli had translated included Enlil arguing for separation, and another god, possibly Enki, arguing that separation was no longer possible because they carry it now in their blood. The tablet survived the looting. Al-Mutawalli's notes did not. She died in 2007. The tablet remains in Baghdad, uncatalogued, untranslated. The looting of the Iraq Museum in April 2003 was one of the great cultural catastrophes of the early 21st century. Over 15,000 objects were stolen in the chaos following the fall of Baghdad, including cuneiform tablets, cylinder seals, statues, and artifacts spanning thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization. Many were recovered eventually through international efforts and cooperation with local communities, but thousands remain missing, scattered through black markets and private collections, lost to scholarship perhaps permanently. Nawala al-Mutawalli was assistant curator of the museum's cuneiform collection, a position she had held since the late 1980s. She had studied at the University of Baghdad, specialized in Old Babylonian texts, and spent her career cataloguing and translating the museum's holdings, working through the backlog of tablets acquired over decades but never fully processed. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, patient, someone who could spend weeks working through a single fragmentary tablet, reconstructing damaged signs, comparing parallel texts, building understanding from incomplete evidence. The tablet she had been translating arrived in the museum's collection sometime in the 1970s, purchased from a dealer in Basra who claimed it came from an unauthorized excavation near ancient Nippur. No field notes, no archaeological context, just the tablet itself and a general claimed provenance. It sat in storage for years before al-Mutawalli pulled it for examination in the late 1990s. The fragment was small, perhaps 1/3 of an original tablet. Old Babylonian script, mythological content based on the divine names she could identify. She mentioned the tablet to colleagues occasionally. In the casual way curators discuss ongoing projects. A dialogue between gods, possibly about humans. Interesting phrasing but very fragmentary, difficult to contextualize without more text. She had translated perhaps 10 or 12 lines, she told one colleague in 2002, and the content was unusual. Gods debating what to do about humanity in language that sounded strategic rather than moral, as if the problem were practical rather than ethical. The specific phrases she mentioned have been reconstructed from colleagues' memories, so they're not verbatim translations, but approximations. Enlil was arguing for separation, or possibly distancing, using a Sumerian word that could mean physical distance or categorical distinction. The argument seemed to be that continued proximity between gods and humans was dangerous, that boundaries needed to be established or strengthened. Another god, al-Mutawalli, thought it might be Enki based on context but couldn't be certain from the damaged text, was arguing against this, saying something like, separation is no longer possible, or the boundary cannot now be fixed because they carry it now in their blood, or it has entered their nature. It was never specified in the preserved portion. The knowledge, the capability, some quality or capacity that had become intrinsic to humanity, that couldn't be removed without destroying humanity entirely, the text didn't clarify. And al-Mutawalli's translation was still provisional, still being refined. She planned to publish it eventually, once she had worked through all the complications, compared it to parallel texts, developed a secure interpretation. There was no urgency. The tablet had waited 30 years. It could wait a few more. Then came the invasion, the chaos, the looting. Display cases shattered, storage rooms ransacked, tablets scattered across floors or stolen entirely. She and other curators worked frantically to save what they could, gathering fragments, hiding priority items, documenting the damage. In those desperate days, al-Mutawalli moved several crates to a basement storage area, covered them with materials that made them look like building supplies or maintenance equipment, mislabeled them in the confused emergency inventory efforts. The tablet was in one of those crates. She told a colleague months later, after some stability had returned, that she had saved it, that it was secure, but her translation notes were gone, taken from her office along with her computer and filing cabinets, either stolen or destroyed. She would have to retranslate from scratch, she said, and she was tired. The trauma of the looting had taken something from her, but eventually she would return to it. The tablet was safe. That was what mattered. Nawala al-Mutawalli died in 2007. Cancer. Relatively quickly. Her colleagues preserved what they could of her work, but most of her recent translations had been on the computer that was stolen, and the backup systems had failed in the war's disruption. The tablets she had been working on were catalogued in general terms, assigned to the backlog for future attention when the museum had resources to continue systematic translation work. The tablet is still there, somewhere in the Iraq Museum's holdings, in a crate or on a shelf, marked with whatever provisional label al-Mutawalli gave it, or perhaps mislabeled entirely. No one knows exactly which tablet it is. The description is too vague. Old Babylonian, fragmentary, mythological dialogue, approximately 1/3 preserved. This could match dozens or hundreds of tablets in the collection. Without al-Mutawalli's specific notes, without her identification of which fragment she was working on, finding it again would require going through the entire backlog, retranslating countless fragments, hoping to recognize the content she described. And so it waits, a dialogue between gods about the human problem, about separation and blood, and something that has become intrinsic to our nature. Words pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago, describing divine anxiety about what humanity was becoming. Translated once, briefly, by a curator who didn't survive to publish her work. Lost now not to destruction but to the overwhelming volume of knowledge waiting to be processed, somewhere in the archives, patient as stone. Across 5,000 years of Mesopotamian texts, from the earliest Sumerian hymns to the latest Babylonian astronomical diaries, a pattern emerges that most scholarship has treated as disconnected data points, but which, assembled, suggests a coherent narrative. Humanity was created for one purpose, but developed capacities beyond that purpose. We were meant to be tools, but became tool users. We were meant to serve, but learned to question. We were given language for communication, but developed it into writing, mathematics, abstract thought. We were taught to observe the heavens for agricultural timing, but turned that observation into astronomy, into understanding the mechanics of celestial motion. At each stage, the mythological texts record divine discomfort, attempts at limitation, moments of alarm, and at each stage, either through Enki's intervention or human persistence or both, we surpassed those limitations. The relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian mythology is not a static hierarchy, but an escalating tension. A story of creation that exceeded its specifications. Think about the trajectory, the arc from creation to the end of cuneiform civilization. In the beginning, according to the Atrahasis, humans were created from clay and divine blood, designed specifically to dig irrigation canals, to free the gods from physical labor. We were biological tools, animated clay, given just enough intelligence to understand and follow instructions, but nothing more. Our purpose was narrow, specific, utilitarian, but something happened. We learned to speak more complexly, to coordinate more effectively. We developed agriculture beyond simple irrigation maintenance, cultivating diverse crops, domesticating animals, creating food surpluses that freed some of us from constant subsistence labor. We invented pottery, weaving, metallurgy. We built permanent settlements that grew into cities. We developed social hierarchies, specialized roles, division of labor that allowed individuals to focus on specific crafts or knowledge domains. And we invented writing. This is perhaps the most significant threshold, the development that changed everything. Writing allowed knowledge to persist across generations, to accumulate and build rather than being rediscovered repeatedly. A scribe could learn what previous scribes had discovered, could start where they ended rather than beginning from scratch. Writing enabled the progressive development of knowledge, the kind of intellectual advancement that would have been impossible with purely oral transmission. With writing came mathematics, because recording quantities required notation, and notation enabled calculation, and calculation revealed patterns that led to theoretical mathematics. With writing came law codes, because social rules needed to be standardized and preserved. With writing came literature, because stories could be refined and elaborated across generations of scribes. With writing came astronomy, because observations could be recorded and compared across decades and centuries. Every domain of human knowledge advanced more rapidly once it could be written, preserved, transmitted, and built upon. The gods had given us language for basic communication, for coordinating labor. We transformed it into a tool for preserving and accumulating knowledge across time. This was not what language was designed for, not what we were supposed to do with the capacity for symbolic communication. But once we had the capacity, we pushed it, developed it, used it for purposes far beyond our original design specifications. And at each major threshold, the mythology records divine response. After humans become too numerous and too knowledgeable, the gods send plague and drought and finally the flood. After humans rebuild and begin constructing towers that reach toward heaven, the gods scatter languages to limit coordination. After humans achieve capabilities that approach divine status, the gods withdraw, establishing distance and limiting direct interaction. The pattern is consistent: human development, divine alarm, divine intervention to limit or control human capability. Yet the interventions never fully succeed. The flood was meant to reset human civilization, but Enki ensured the wisest humans survived, carrying pre-flood knowledge into the post-flood world. The scattering of languages was meant to prevent large-scale coordination, but humans developed trade networks and diplomatic systems and cultural exchange that transcended linguistic boundaries. The divine withdrawal was meant to preserve mystery and authority, but it created space for human investigation and secular knowledge development that demystified the cosmos. By the first millennium BCE, humans had developed mathematics sophisticated enough to model celestial mechanics, astronomy precise enough to predict eclipses, medicine advanced enough to perform surgery and treat complex diseases, philosophy sophisticated enough to debate the nature of reality and divinity. We had created empires spanning continents, built cities housing hundreds of thousands, developed technologies that seemed almost magical to earlier generations. We had become, in almost every measurable way, what the mythology warned against: beings whose knowledge and capability approached or even exceeded divine levels. And we did this not through rebellion, but through persistence, through curiosity, through the systematic application of intelligence to understanding the world around us. We were created to dig canals, but we couldn't help observing patterns while we dug, couldn't help asking why and how, couldn't help developing better tools and techniques, couldn't help teaching our children what we learned and building on what our parents taught us. The capacity for this kind of progressive development might have been unintended, a side effect of making us intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, but once it existed, we used it. The Mesopotamian textual record, read as a whole, tells the story of this transformation from designed tool to autonomous investigator, from created servant to knowledgeable being who understands the mechanisms of reality the gods supposedly controlled. And throughout this story, the gods are not absent but reactive, responding to human development with alarm and limitation strategies that consistently fail to prevent continued human advancement. It's a mythology of creation that got out of control, of designed beings who exceeded their design, of a relationship between creator and created that transformed from hierarchy to competition to the gods' eventual withdrawal, leaving humans in possession of the earth and the knowledge to understand it. Which brings us to the hypothesis that emerges from this evidence, uncomfortable and speculative, but consistent with the textual record, that the Anunnaki, whatever they were, whether gods or metaphors or memories of something else entirely, came to fear humanity, not because we were rebellious, but because we were successful, because we took what they gave us, or what we stole, and used it to transform ourselves into something they didn't intend and couldn't entirely control, because we demonstrated a capacity for adaptation, innovation, and understanding that suggested we might eventually surpass even them. The flood narratives, the limitations on knowledge, the withdrawal of direct divine presence, the anxiety about human reproduction and collaboration, all of it fits a pattern not of gods disappointed in their servants, but of creators alarmed by their creation. And if this reading is correct, then the most important question becomes not why the gods created us, but why they decided we needed to be stopped, and whether they ever truly succeeded. This is the fear hypothesis, that every intervention, every limitation, every withdrawal documented in Mesopotamian mythology represents not divine anger at human sin, but divine anxiety about human capability. That the gods looked at us and saw not disappointing servants, but emerging competitors, beings who were learning too much, growing too capable, approaching too closely to divine status. That the cosmic hierarchy was never secure, but always precarious, maintained through knowledge, monopoly, and power imbalance that human development was progressively undermining. Consider what this means about the nature of divinity in Mesopotamian thought. If the gods feared human capability, that suggests godhood was not an ontological category, not a matter of fundamental different nature, but a status based on knowledge and power. The gods were not inherently superior beings, but beings who possessed and wielded certain capabilities humans lacked. And if those capabilities could be learned or acquired or developed by humans, then the boundary between God and human was not absolute but permeable, crossable, ultimately unsustainable. This reading explains the specific anxieties recorded in the texts. The gods worried about human reproduction because larger populations meant more knowledge generation and transmission. They worried about human cities because urban concentration enabled rapid cultural and technical development. They worried about human writing because it allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations. They worried about human mathematics and astronomy because these revealed the natural mechanisms underlying supposedly divine phenomena. Each anxiety makes sense if the gods recognized that human development was progressively eroding divine monopoly on cosmic knowledge and power. And the interventions, viewed through this lens, were attempts to slow or prevent humans from crossing thresholds that would make us functionally divine. The flood was meant to destroy the knowledge and capability humans had accumulated. The scattering of languages was meant to prevent the kind of large-scale coordination that enables rapid advancement. The reproductive limitations were meant to keep populations below levels that generate threatening cultural complexity. The withdrawal was meant to limit human access to divine knowledge through direct observation. Each intervention targeted specific aspects of human development that the gods found most threatening, but the interventions failed, or succeeded only partially and temporarily. Each attempt to limit human capability bought time but didn't reverse the fundamental trajectory. We continued developing, continued learning, continued approaching the thresholds the gods wanted to prevent us from crossing. And eventually, the gods seemed to have recognized that preventing human advancement was impossible, that the best they could achieve was slowing it, creating friction but not stopping the process. By the late 1st millennium BCE, humans had effectively achieved what the mythology suggested was forbidden. We understood celestial mechanics. We could predict supposedly divine phenomena. We had developed philosophical frameworks for understanding reality that didn't require gods as explanatory factors. We had created civilizations of immense sophistication and power. We had become, for practical purposes, the knowledgeable beings the gods had tried to prevent us from becoming. The fact that we still worshipped gods, still maintained temples and priesthoods, was increasingly a matter of social tradition rather than actual dependence on divine intervention. The fear hypothesis suggests that Mesopotamian mythology preserves a memory of this transformation, encoded in stories about divine human conflict, about knowledge theft, about boundaries crossed and limitations imposed and withdrawals enacted. Whether the Anunnaki were literal gods or symbolic representations of some other power dynamic, the pattern is clear. Those with power and knowledge feared those they had created or ruled when the created or ruled began developing their own power and knowledge. And here's the most unsettling implication. If the fear hypothesis is correct, if the gods' anxiety about human capability was justified from their perspective, then we are the thing they were afraid we would become. We are the creation that exceeded its design specifications, the servant species that learned to question and investigate and understand. We carry in our nature, in our blood, as that fragmentary tablet suggested, whatever quality or capacity alarmed the cosmic powers enough to attempt our destruction and limitation. The gods, if they existed, if they withdrew, if they're watching from whatever distance they established, see us now as we are, knowledgeable beyond their efforts at restriction, capable beyond the simple tool function we were designed for. We have crossed every threshold they tried to prevent us from crossing. We have become what they feared, and whether they succeeded in stopping us depends entirely on what thresholds remain, what capabilities we haven't yet developed, what final boundaries between human and divine we haven't yet crossed. The story, despite 5,000 years of accumulated text, might not be finished. We might still be becoming whatever it was the Anunnaki truly feared. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider the ancient scribes pressing warnings into wet clay by lamplight, knowing they would never see the future they were trying to protect or the future they were trying to prevent. Consider the gods, whatever they were, withdrawing to their heavens as humans grew too knowledgeable to manage up close, watching from distance as we became exactly what they feared we might become. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. In Baghdad, somewhere in storage, a fragment waits with words about separation and blood, about something carried in our nature that cannot be removed. In London and Berlin and Chicago and Istanbul, tens of thousands of tablets sit uncatalogued, untranslated, holding stories and warnings and knowledge from a world that ended 5,000 years ago, but somehow never stopped speaking to us. Perhaps the Anunnaki were gods who genuinely feared their creation. Perhaps they were something else entirely, some power or presence our ancestors remembered imperfectly, encoding their anxiety in mythological language because they had no other vocabulary for what they witnessed. Or perhaps they were metaphor all along, representations of the tension every generation faces between preservation and progress, between accepting limitations and exceeding them, between remaining what we were designed to be and becoming something new. But the pattern remains, written in thousands of tablets scattered across museums and collections worldwide. We were created for one purpose and became something else. We were meant to serve and learn to question. We were given capabilities for narrow functions and used them to investigate the deepest structures of reality. We exceeded our specifications. We crossed boundaries we were meant to respect. We became dangerous to whatever powers wanted us controllable. And we did this not through rebellion but through curiosity, not through violence but through patient observation and accumulated knowledge, not through destroying what came before but through building on it, generation after generation, each teaching the next, each pushing slightly further into understanding. You carry this in your blood, this capacity for exceeding limitations, this drive to understand what you were told simply to accept. You are the descendant of the ones who survived every flood, every scattering, every attempt at limitation. You are what the gods feared you would become, so let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, under the same stars they tracked with such intensity. You're connected to them across 5,000 years, part of the same human story of watching, wondering, and refusing to stop asking why. Rest now. The ancient world will still be here, waiting with its questions and its warnings and its impossible knowledge. When you wake, the clay remembers everything. And so do you. Sleep well,